They didn't become queens to die, but many of them did. No crown in England ever demanded so much blood, so many secrets, or so many silent screams behind locked doors. 6 women stepped into the same throne, yet none walked out the same way. Their stories weren't written by love, but by fear, fate, and the king who rewrote their lives at will. Tonight, you will stand where they stood and feel the price of being queen. So, before you feel comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Only if your heart truly wants to. If you do like it, leave a little comment letting me know what time it is where you are. Now, dim the lights. Adjust the pillow to fit your head. Maybe turn on a fan to create a relaxing atmosphere. And let's begin this journey together tonight. If one were to stand at the edge of Henry VIII's court and watch the women who walked its polished corridors, the first impression would be one of elegance and calm. Silk gowns rustled softly, jewels caught the candlelight, and every gesture seemed measured, graceful, and deliberate. To an outsider, it might have looked like a world built on order, beauty, and privilege, but anyone who stayed long enough would begin to sense the quiet tension beneath the surface. A tension so constant that it became part of the air itself. Behind every polite smile lay calculation, and behind every lowered gaze lay fear. The crown that rested on a queen's head was not a symbol of safety. It was a warning of how easily everything could be taken away. The court prized appearances above all. The king wished to see harmony, obedience, and devotion in the women around him. So they learned to move with care, to speak with restraint, and to smile even when their stomachs tightened with dread. Those who watched them from afar might have assumed they lived charmed lives. Yet the truth was that each queen carried the weight of uncertainty from the moment she entered the palace. 6 women wore the same crown in succession, and not one of them left the throne on her own terms. Their stories were whispered about in later generations as tales of tragedy. But within the palace, they unfolded in real time, quietly, step by step, like a slow tightening of a noose. The crown demanded perfection. A queen was expected to be loyal, gracious, fartile, and unwaveringly obedient. She had to embody virtue not only for herself, but for the entire kingdom. Any perceived flaw became a danger, a failed pregnancy, a rumor, a misplaced word. Each could shift the king's mood, and his moods were legendary for their volatility. A single breath could turn admiration into suspicion, and suspicion into accusation. Those who lived closest to him learned that affection was a fragile shield. The crown did not protect them, it exposed them. The palace walls carried stories of the women who had tried and failed to meet the impossible standards set for them. Some had been adored, some tolerated, some dismissed, and some destroyed. The same halls that echoed with music during celebrations had also heard the footsteps of guards escorting a fallen queen away. This duality, splendor wrapped around fear, defined the daily life of every woman who dared to sit beside the king. The throne was offered as an honor, but everyone who observed closely understood it was just another way of placing a woman in the reach of danger. To the public, the royal marriage appeared as a fairy tale union, a symbol of divine order and stability. Yet inside the court, it resembled a game whose rules shifted whenever the king's desires changed. Devotion alone could not save a queen. The women learned quickly that being admired by Henry VIII meant little when competing with his ambition, frustration, or dissatisfaction. They were praised and condemned by the same hand, often within the same season. Those who whispered their hopes in private chambers also whispered prayers for survival. It was easy to misjudge the atmosphere of the palace. Lavish feasts, grand ceremonies, and glittering jewels created the image of harmony. But the people within the court understood the truth. Power never rested quietly. Henry VIII, was a king who saw obedience as a necessity, not a request. When a queen pleased him, she was honored and protected. When she failed, the consequences were swift and unforgiving. The absence of visible danger lulled no one. The calm before a storm was still the presence of a storm. Watching a queen walk toward the king was like watching someone step onto thin ice. Each movement had to be measured. Each word weighed before it was spoken. The women understood that their fate depended not only on their devotion, but also on the unpredictable whims of a man who believed his desires were the will of God. The court functioned under this silent law. The king's dissatisfaction was enough to rewrite a woman's life entirely. 6 women entered the palace, believing, or pretending to believe, that they could bear the weight of the crown. Some entered with hope, some with ambition, some with resignation. None of them truly understood the full cost before it was too late. Their stories revealed a pattern. The crown did not belong to the strong, nor to the loyal, nor to the beloved. It belonged to those who could survive the longest under the king's gaze. And even that survival was often temporary. In the great halls, musicians played soft melodies, and courtiers exchanged polite courtesies. Yet beneath every note and gesture lay the quiet knowledge that the court was a place where power shifted with alarming speed. A queen could rise in the morning as the king's cherished companion and fall by nightfall into disgrace. The palace did not need bloodshed to enforce fear. Fear was woven into its routines. It shaped conversations, determined alliances, and controlled futures. Observers who tried to understand the fate of Henry's queens often looked for dramatic turning points. A betrayal, a scandal, an accusation. But the truth was simpler and crueler. The danger had always been there. From the moment the crown touched their heads, it was not a single decision that doomed them, but the very structure of the world they entered. A queen's life was built on fragile foundations, and everyone around her knew it. Even the ornaments she wore, heavy with gold and jewels, felt like reminders of the burden resting on her shoulders. From a distance, one might believe the queens of Henry VIII were chosen for love or destiny, but anyone standing inside the palace for more than a day would see a different picture. They were chosen for convenience, replaced for dissatisfaction, and judged according to standards they could never fully meet. The crown was bestowed as an honor, but it functioned as a test, one that few passed without paying a terrible price. And yet, despite everything, the court remained a place of ambition. Families pushed their daughters forward. Courtiers whispered of opportunities. Even those who understood the danger could not resist the allure of proximity to power. The crown shimmered brightly enough to blind those who sought it, and its victims were mourned only briefly before the next woman stepped forward, willing or not, into the same role. The story of Henry VIII's queens began long before any of them realized it had started. It was shaped by politics, faith, ego, and the hunger for control. Each woman who wore the crown stepped into a narrative already in motion, unable to stop it, unable to escape it. The crown demanded sacrifice, and history recorded each payment in quiet, unchanging terms. Everything just described reveals how fragile the throne truly was for those who touched it. Another layer of this story waits where expectations tighten, and the king's will sharpens, and somewhere in that space, a single failure begins to reshape a queen's entire world. The expectations placed on a Tudor queen were so rigid that they seemed carved into the very stones of the palace. Anyone observing her life up close would see that every moment was shaped by rules she did not write and obligations she could never fully satisfy. A queen was not simply a wife, she was a symbol of lineage, stability, and morality, and she was judged constantly by eyes that never softened. Her value was measured not in her thoughts or her character, but in her ability to perform the duties assigned to her the day she entered the king's household. Those duties began with loyalty and obedience. But above all, they circled a single requirement: She had to give the king a son. The pressure to produce a male heir was not spoken loudly in public, but it was present in every whisper behind closed doors. Courtiers observed her body more closely than her words. Every change in her appearance, every moment of fatigue, every rumor about her health became a topic of speculation. When she appeared in public, people watched her as if their future depended on her womb alone. It did not matter whether the queen was educated, kind, or politically astute. If she failed to deliver a son, her worth in the king's eyes diminished with each passing year. The fear surrounding pregnancy ran deep. Each queen lived with the knowledge that childbirth, already dangerous in Tudor England, carried an additional threat: political consequences. A miscarriage could be interpreted as a sign of weakness. A stillborn daughter might be treated as a personal failure. A living son was celebrated as proof of divine favor, while anything else was quietly folded into conversations about disappointment or blame. The queen learned early that the line between honor and ruin was drawn by forces far beyond her control. Her behavior was constrained by equally unforgiving expectations. A Tudor queen was expected to embody virtue and dignity at all times. She moved with caution, spoke with restraint, and avoided anything that might be misinterpreted. Even a glance held too long, or a word spoken too warmly, could be twisted into suspicion. She was surrounded by ladies-in-waiting who monitored her interactions, not out of malice, but because the court demanded constant surveillance. Nothing was private for a queen. Her friendships were watched, her conversations noted, her tone interpreted and reinterpreted. Those who judged her did so with a quiet certainty. The court believed it could recognize moral failing at a distance. A moment of frustration, a lapse in patience, or even a private grief seen at the wrong time could be turned against her. The queen was expected to move through her life as if she were made of glass, transparent and flawless. Any crack, however small, threatened to become a point of attack. Those who wished to weaken her position needed only to point to a gesture, a rumor, or a misinterpreted kindness, and let suspicion grow from there. The king himself played an unspoken role in these standards. His approval shaped how others treated the queen. If he looked at her kindly, she was praised. If he frowned, courtiers noticed. A change in his mood became a signal that her position might be shifting. The tension created by this instability affected every interaction she had. She learned to speak cautiously, to greet people with carefully measured warmth, and to avoid any behavior that might give the impression of ambition or impropriety. The public, too, held expectations. Ordinary people who never stepped foot inside the palace still felt entitled to judge their queen. They wanted a woman who represented the stability of the realm, someone who would bear a future king and preserve continuity. They admired grace and modesty, but they also demanded fertility and unwavering devotion. When news spread, accurate or not, that a queen had disappointed these expectations, murmurs began to rise in marketplaces, taverns, and churchyards. The queen felt the weight of this unseen scrutiny, even when she never heard the whispers directly. Religious morality wove another layer into the expectations placed upon her. She was regarded as a model of Christian virtue, someone whose conduct reflected the purity of the realm itself. A queen who appeared too independent, too assertive, or too worldly could be criticized for failing to embody the humility expected of her role. The paradox was cruel. She was supposed to be strong enough to support the king, yet gentle enough never to overshadow him. She was to be intelligent, but never too opinionated, gracious, but never overly familiar, visible, but never too bold. The standards set for her were impossible by design. Even when she met them, people found ways to question her. If she spoke too little, she was cold. If she smiled too much, she was frivolous. If she avoided the company of men, she was accused of pride. If she allowed herself to be seen enjoying conversation, She was suspected of impropriety. These judgments came not from evidence, but from long-held beliefs about what a queen ought to be, shaped by tradition and reinforced by fear. Within the palace, the queen's life became a continuous effort to maintain equilibrium. She had to comfort the king without appearing manipulative, to advise him without appearing controlling, and obey him without appearing weak. Every action requires balance. Every misstep threatened consequences far greater than embarrassment. People in the court understood this dynamic so clearly that some deliberately tested the boundaries of her patience, searching for signs of vulnerability that might be used later. Meanwhile, the queen herself lived with a quiet dread that never faded. She knew that other women had come before her, each believing they could navigate the demands of the role, each ultimately discovering that the standards were too narrow for any human being to satisfy. She knew their stories because the palace remembered them, whispered them, and repeated them in warning. She walked through the same halls where they once walked. She sat at the same feasts, listened to the same musicians, and felt the same eyes lingering too long on her. The knowledge that she might share their fate settled upon her shoulders every day. Yet even with this understanding, the world expected her to appear calm and composed. Her face remained serene even when her thoughts raced. She smiled because she had no choice. She endured because endurance was the only thing she could offer in a system that allowed her no true power. Her survival depended on silence, restraint, and a constant awareness of how fragile her position truly was. The expectations that shaped her life revealed how little freedom she truly possessed. What unfolded beyond these rules would reach even deeper into the structure surrounding her. And somewhere within that structure, the first cracks in a queen's security would quietly begin to appear. The presence of Henry VIII shaped the atmosphere of the court long before he spoke a single word. Those who observed him closely understood that his authority did not merely rest on the crown he wore, but on the certainty that no one could oppose him without risking everything. He carried power the way others carried breath, effortlessly, instinctively, and without the faintest notion that it might ever be questioned. This power extended into every corner of the realm, but nowhere was it felt more sharply than within his marriages. A queen in his presence learned quickly that she was not an equal partner. She was someone who existed within the boundaries he created, boundaries that could tighten at any moment. Henry's rule over his queens began with the laws that supported him. The people believed that a king's authority was ordained by God, and Henry used that belief as both shield and weapon. His decisions were framed not as personal desires, but as necessities for the stability of England. When he wished to break his first marriage, he challenged the Pope himself and reshaped the country's religious landscape. If the world's most powerful church could be pushed aside to satisfy the king's will, what hope did a queen have of defending herself against him? Those who lived in the court saw how easily Henry's favour shifted. One moment, he spoke tenderly to a queen, praising her virtues. The next, he grew distant, irritated, or impatient. His displeasure spread quickly through the palace, and courtiers adjusted their behaviour at once. When Henry stopped smiling at a queen, others began stepping away from her. Ministers hesitated before offering her support. Friends spoke more cautiously. Even her own family watched for signs of danger. His emotions carried consequences that rippled outward, shaping lives in ways he might not even have noticed. A queen's reputation depended entirely on his mood. If Henry declared her virtuous, the court praised her. If he hinted at disappointment, whispers began within hours. His voice had the power to turn suspicion into truth, and truth into irrelevance. Evidence rarely mattered. Once he believed something, or needed to believe it, the machinery of the court shifted to support him. Investigations were opened, accusations recorded, testimonies shaped, and conclusions reached with startling speed. A single royal declaration could erase a woman's past, redefine her present, and determine her future. The king's control extended beyond politics and into the most intimate aspects of a queen's life. Her body was treated as a vessel for the heir he demanded. Her health, her pregnancies, her miscarriages. These were not private experiences, but matters of state. Henry expected transparency in every detail, yet offered none of his own vulnerabilities in return. If she failed to produce a son, she risked losing her position, her safety, or even her life. The imbalance was absolute. The king's disappointments were seen as injustices committed against him, while a queen's suffering rarely earned sympathy. In private chambers, the atmosphere was no less controlled. Even moments meant to be tender were overshadowed by the weight of expectation. A queen could not express fear or uncertainty without risking misinterpretation. She learned to choose her words carefully, to maintain composure even when the stakes were painfully high. Her survival depended not only on what she did, but on how Henry interpreted it. A breath held too long, a hesitation before answering, a neutral expression mistaken for defiance. These could all become seeds of doubt. What made Henry's control so effective was its unpredictability. Those around him could never be sure which version of the king they would encounter. At times, he seemed generous, charismatic, and deeply invested in the well-being of his court. At other moments, he revealed a colder nature, calculating, impatient, and quick to anger. This inconsistency created an environment where caution became instinctive. Everyone walked carefully, but queens walked most carefully of all. For a queen, the most dangerous truth was that her emotions did not weigh unless they aligned with the king's aims. Her distress could be dismissed as an inconvenience. Her loyalty could be overshadowed by a single, unfounded rumor. Her love for him, no matter how genuine, could not protect her. Henry valued devotion only when it supported his ambitions. When it no longer served him, he replaced it without hesitation. The fate of those who disappointed him stood as a reminder. His affection could be withdrawn more swiftly than it was given, and the consequences of its absence were often irreversible. To those watching from the outside, the court appeared orderly, even magnificent. But beneath the surface, the queen's life resembled a structure built on shifting sand. She stood at the center of a system designed to elevate her in title, while depriving her of real power. The king's authority overshadowed her every decision, every gesture, every breath. She existed in a world where her highest achievement was survival, and even that was never guaranteed. The reach of his authority showed how completely her fate depended on him. From there, the story moves toward the pressure that surrounds every expectation placed upon her. Somewhere within that pressure, a truth long concealed begins to stir. Pressure at Henry VIII's court settled over a queen's life with a weight that could not be seen, but was always felt. No proclamation announced the expectation, yet every person inside the palace understood it clearly. Her survival depended on producing a male heir. It was not a superstition whispered by servants or a warning shared among women. It was a political truth, shaped by the fear of instability and the king's own determination to secure the future of his dynasty. Everything around her, from the way courtiers watched her movements to the way ambassadors reported her health, reminded her that her entire identity had narrowed to a single, unforgiving requirement. Succession anxiety haunted England. The memory of past civil conflicts lingered, and the court feared any outcome that might leave the throne vulnerable. A daughter, no matter how noble, represented uncertainty. Foreign powers could challenge her rule. Factions could rise against her, and the kingdom might fracture under competing claims. In this environment, the demand for a son was not framed as cruelty, but as necessity. Yet its consequences were deeply cruel for the women who bore the responsibility. Their marriages, reputations, and very lives were tied to outcomes that lay entirely beyond their control. Every pregnancy placed the queen under a spotlight that followed her relentlessly. Courtiers studied her expression at banquet, Noting even the smallest change in appetite or posture, ladies-in-waiting monitored her for signs that would become whispers before nightfall. The moment she appeared pale, tired, or anxious, speculation spread through the palace like a draft through an open corridor. Her body became a forum for public interpretation, while her own experience of pregnancy, its pain, fear, and uncertainty, remained hidden behind the composure she was expected to display. A successful pregnancy did not end the scrutiny. If she carried a girl, disappointment fell quietly but heavily around her. If she miscarried, the sorrow she felt was overshadowed by suspicion. Some believed she had failed morally or spiritually. Others suggested she had fallen out of divine favor. Scientific understanding offered her no refuge. The court viewed her womb as the sole determinant of succession and treated every outcome as a reflection of her worth. A pregnancy lost was not only a source of grief, but it was also a strike against her security. Henry VIII's belief in male responsibility for determining a child's sex was non-existent. He accepted without question the idea that a woman alone determined the result. When he did not receive the heir he desired, resentment grew quickly and visibly. The Queen felt this shift in his mood long before others did. A changed tone in his voice, a shorter glance across the table, a colder silence in private gatherings. Each of these signaled danger. The king's frustration wound itself around her life like a tightening cord. Catherine of Aragon had endured this pressure for many years. She entered marriage with hope and conviction, believing her devotion and strength would sustain her. But one pregnancy after another ended in sorrow. The few children she bore who lived did not include the long-awaited son. Her faith, her patience, and her dignity earned her respect within the court. Yet, none of that mattered when weighed against the single expectation she could not fulfill. As time passed, Henry's disappointment hardened into resolve. Her failure to give him a surviving male heir became the justification he needed to dismantle their marriage piece by piece. Anne Boleyn discovered how quickly favour could shift. Henry had reshaped the country's religious structure to make her queen. Yet the protection she thought unbreakable dissolved the moment she failed to provide him with a son. She did bear a daughter, but further pregnancies ended in loss. Each disappointment deepened the king's frustration. The court sensed his growing distance and adjusted accordingly, withdrawing support even before formal accusations emerged. Her inability to produce the desired heir became the silent foundation for the charges that would later condemn her. Within this system, a queen's life existed in a fragile space where biology dictated her safety. The cruel irony was that she bore responsibility for something she could never influence. Each attempt, each failure, each moment of hope, followed by despair, carved new lines into her reputation. The court rarely questioned the fairness of this expectation. Instead, it accepted the logic of the age. A queen must provide a son, or she must face the consequences. The emotional toll was immense but rarely acknowledged. A queen suffered in silence because her grief was considered secondary to the needs of the realm. Her fear of failure hung over her like a shadow that lengthened with each passing year. Even moments of joy were tempered by the knowledge that the future remained uncertain until she gave birth to a male heir. Her body was seen not as her own but as an instrument for political continuity. Observers who studied the pattern of Henry's marriages could see the inevitability embedded within them. A queen succeeded when she produced a son and failed when she did not. All other attributes, loyalty, intelligence, and faithfulness, were decorations that meant little in the face of this single demand. Fate, our chance, and biology held more power over her future than her actions ever could. The burden placed upon her exposed how little control she had over her own destiny. Further into her story lies the unraveling of loyalties she believed would protect her. At a certain point in that unraveling, the first quiet signs of collapse begin to reveal themselves. Catherine of Aragon's life inside Henry VIII's court unfolded slowly. shaped by duty, devotion, and a quiet determination that seldom broke. When she married Henry at 17, she entered the union with the steady confidence of someone raised for responsibility. Observers who saw her in those early years often described her as composed, sincere, and unwavering in her sense of purpose. She believed her marriage would strengthen the realm and anchor the king. And for a time, it seemed she was right. The court admired her gentleness, her education, and the dignity with which she carried her title. But admiration was not protection, and the years ahead exposed how fragile her position truly was. Pregnancy defined much of Catherine's life. Each time she carried a child, the court held its breath, waiting for signs that England's future might finally be secure. A son would have solidified her place beside Henry, ensuring not only her safety, but also her influence. Instead, she endured a series of losses that wore at her spirit more deeply than anyone around her understood. Miscarriages and infant deaths struck repeatedly, leaving her with grief that she had no choice but to bear in silence. She prayed, she persisted, and she tried again, driven by the weight of expectation and the fear of what failure might bring. The one surviving child, Princess Mary, gave Catherine hope. But the hope was fragile. A daughter did not quiet the questions about succession, nor did it ease the king's dissatisfaction. Henry wanted stability for the Tudor line, and he convinced himself that such stability could only come through a son. As the years passed without one, Catherine's position weakened. The court grew restless. Ambassadors whispered about the king's frustrations. Friends who once stood confidently beside her began to hesitate. Sensing the shift in the king's mood long before accusations were spoken aloud, Catherine did nothing to provoke danger. She remained loyal, disciplined, and deeply committed to her role as queen. Yet her devotion mattered little in a world where her value was measured primarily through childbirth. The blame for failed pregnancies fell entirely on her, though no one understood the complexities of such losses. Henry never questioned his own role, or the simple biological truth that he could have been the source of the problem. Instead, he allowed disappointment to harden into resentment, and resentment into justification. When Anne Boleyn entered the court, Catherine's fate became clearer to those who watched closely. Henry's attention shifted. Conversations changed. The king's gaze lingered elsewhere, leaving Catherine increasingly isolated. She continued her duties with grace, but the distance between herself and the king widened in ways she could not bridge. What made the situation more painful was Catherine's unwavering commitment to her marriage. She believed in the sanctity of the union, both religiously and personally. She believed Henry would ultimately remember the years they had shared, the loyalty she had shown, and the burdens she had carried for him. But the king's desire for a son and for Anne overpowered every memory. Henry's efforts to annul the marriage placed Catherine in a position she never imagined. He argued that their union had been invalid from the start. Citing theology and political necessity, Catherine rejected these claims, insisting with calm resolve that she was his lawful wife. Her refusal to yield angered the king, who expected obedience from those around him. The more steadfast she remained, the more he saw her as an obstacle to his ambitions. The court watched this unfolding conflict with a mixture of fascination and fear, aware that the king's determination rarely softened once set. Eventually, Henry stripped Catherine of her title, pronouncing her not queen but Dowager Princess of Wales. The change was more than ceremonial. It marked her fall from the centre of power to the margins of the realm. She was moved away from court, separated from her daughter, and placed under a kind of quiet confinement that disguised its cruelty beneath formal politeness. Those who had once served her were ordered to withdraw. Only a small household remained, loyal out of respect rather than ambition. In her final years, Catherine lived with dignity despite the isolation imposed on her. She wrote letters expressing her continued loyalty to Henry, even as she acknowledged the injustice she faced. Her strength did not fade, but her health declined steadily. The court seldom spoke of her, preferring to let her fade from memory, while the king built a new life with his new queen. She died far from the glittering halls where she had once stood proudly as Henry's partner, leaving behind a legacy shaped not by triumph, but by endurance. Her story revealed the vulnerability of even the most devoted queen. Catherine had given Henry her youth, her loyalty, and her best efforts to secure the dynasty. Yet none of it had been enough. Her fall was not caused by scandal or betrayal, but by circumstance and the king's shifting desires. Observers who reflected on her fate saw a pattern that would repeat in the lives of the women who followed her. Her long decline showed how devotion offered no shield against the king's ambitions. Beyond her story lies the widening gap between desire and consequence inside the court. In the deepening of that gap, the next queen's rise begins to cast its shadow. Anne Boleyn's rise in Henry VIII's court unfolded with a speed and intensity that unsettled nearly everyone who witnessed it. She entered the king's view not as another courtly ornament, but as someone who carried a sharp presence. Confident, perceptive, and unwilling to settle for the quiet pathways expected of women. Observers saw how Henry's interest shifted almost immediately, drawn not only to her appearance, but to the spark she brought into every conversation. She did not bend easily, and that resistance made her irresistible to a king accustomed to instant compliance. What began as a fascination soon hardened into an obsession that altered the course of England itself. Henry pursued Anne with a determination few dared to question. His letters to her, filled with longing and impatience, revealed a king who believed he could shape destiny according to his desires. Anne, however, refused to become merely another mistress. She held back, allowing tension to build, understanding instinctively that denying a king could magnify her power. The strategy worked. Henry began to imagine a future in which Anne, not Catherine, stood beside him as queen. His desire for her collided with his craving for a male heir. And together, these forces pushed him into decisions that would fracture the nation's relationship with the Pope and redefine its religious structure. Anne's elevation to queen came with spectacle and triumph. But the triumph disguised a fragile foundation. Many in the court resented her influence, believing she had manipulated the king or disrupted the stability of the kingdom. Others feared her sharp intellect and quick perception, qualities rarely praised in women of her rank. Even those who supported her privately wondered whether the forces that carried her upward were too volatile to sustain her. The crown she finally received gleamed brightly, but it brought her into a space where danger settled quietly around every corner. Her marriage to Henry began with promise. She gave birth to a daughter, Princess Elizabeth, and the court celebrated with the hope that more children would follow. But Henry's expectations narrowed almost immediately. He wanted a son, and as months passed without one, impatience returned to his voice. The loss of later pregnancies weakened Anne in ways she could not conceal. Courtiers watched the king's disappointment grow, sensing the shift in his tone, the cooling of his affection, the quiet withdrawal of the shield he once provided. Rumours began to rustle like dry leaves, small at first, barely noticed, then louder as political motives shaped them. Anne's confidence, once a source of fascination, became fuel for criticism. Her sharp comments were interpreted as arrogance. Her assertiveness was labelled as manipulation. Those who opposed her used her every gesture as evidence that she threatened the natural order of the court. Enemies surrounded her, some driven by personal resentment, while others were motivated by political opportunity. They whispered into the king's ear, feeding his doubts, offering explanations for his disappointments that centered not on chance or biology, but on the queen he had once adored. The accusations that eventually emerged, treason, adultery, and even incest, were extraordinary in their cruelty and implausibility. Anne's supposed betrayals were described with confidence, but supported by almost nothing. Yet in a court shaped by Henry's desires, evidence was unnecessary. Once suspicion took root in his mind, everything that followed became inevitable. His version of truth reshaped the world around him. The machinery of the trial moved swiftly, designed not to uncover facts, but to confirm the conclusion already reached. Anne must fall. Her arrest shocked even those who disliked her. She was taken from her chambers with a mixture of fear and disbelief, still processing the abrupt collapse of everything she had fought for. In the tower, she maintained a calm that unsettled her guards. She insisted she was innocent, not with desperation but with clarity. Witnesses later described moments when she spoke with remarkable composure, even as she faced charges that carried only one possible outcome. She seemed to understand that her fate had already been sealed long before her arrest, sealed by the expectations she could never meet, the alliances she could not trust, and the king she could no longer influence. Her trial was more of a performance than a search for justice. The men who sat in judgment had already sensed the direction of the king's will. They condemned her with a swiftness that exposed the hollow nature of the proceedings. Even as her name was declared guilty, some in the court felt a quiet dread, aware that her fall revealed the precarious nature of power for anyone close to the king. Not just queens. Those who celebrated did so carefully, hiding the recognition that the same forces that destroyed Anne could turn on them without warning. Anne faced her execution with a steadiness that left a lasting impression. Her final speech avoided bitterness. Offering prayers for the king and the realm, she carried herself with dignity, even as the crowd gathered in tense silence to witness the outcome of a tragedy shaped by ambition, expectation, and political convenience. When the sword fell, it ended not only her life, but also the illusion that the crown offered safety to those who wore it. Her story revealed a truth that resonated through the court long after her death. Rise too quickly, and the fall becomes sharper. Gain the king's desire, and you inherit his discontent. Wield influence, and you awaken enemies who prosper in your absence. Her brief reign showed how swiftly admiration could turn into danger. Further into the unfolding story lies the growing pattern of loss, wrapped in royal ambition. Within that pattern, the next attempt to secure a future tightens the court's unease. Judgment in Henry VIII's court did not arrive with thunder or ceremony. It often arrived in silence, signalled only by the faintest change in the king's expression. Those who lived close to him learned to read these shifts with the same urgency a sailor reads the wind. A narrowed eye, a tense jaw, a slight tightening around the mouth. These were warnings that could reshape a queen's entire world. Power flowed from Henry so absolutely that even his smallest gestures carried consequences. A queen who noticed these changes knew that safety could vanish long before anyone spoke a word aloud. Nothing protected her once the king's affections faltered. The crown she wore granted her ceremony, status, and visibility, but it did not grant her security. She might walk beside Henry in public with the appearance of harmony, yet privately sensed that the balance had begun to tilt. The court noticed these shifts with unnerving speed. Servants moved differently around her. Courtiers approached with hesitation. Allies spoke in more cautious tones. No one ever announced that danger was approaching. The atmosphere simply thickened until she understood it for herself. Henry's moods were unpredictable, shaped by frustration, desire, fear of instability, and his own conviction that he embodied divine authority. A queen could do nothing to steady him. She could only adjust to the turns of his temperament. When he was pleased, the palace basked in warmth. When he was troubled, shadows lengthened in every corner. People stepped more quietly, spoke with greater care, and avoided offering opinions that might conflict with his. A queen, trapped at the center of this shifting terrain, had to maintain composure even as she felt the ground beneath her feet begin to shift. It was common knowledge among those at court that once Henry's interest faded, The woman beside him faced an uncertain future. He did not abandon lightly, he abandoned decisively. When admiration transformed into irritation, the transition was irreversible. He expected unwavering devotion but offered no guarantee of his own. His disappointment hardened quickly into judgment. And judgment implied guilt, whether or not any wrongdoing existed. A queen, who had once been praised for her virtues, could be condemned for those same qualities if the king's opinion turned against her. Political forces magnified these dangers. Courtiers watched Henry closely, adjusting their loyalties in real time. If they sensed dissatisfaction directed toward the queen, they began to distance themselves from her. Some offered the king subtle reassurances that removing her might strengthen alliances or stabilize the kingdom. Others remained silent, not out of neutrality but out of fear. No one wanted to be aligned with a woman who might soon fall from favor. The queen became increasingly isolated, and isolation made her vulnerable to accusations she could not defend against. An accusation in Henry's court did not require evidence. Suspicion alone could be enough to begin a process that moved with alarming speed. The tools used against her: interrogations, confessions extracted under pressure, witnesses motivated by ambition or fear, were designed not to uncover truth but to reinforce the king's assumptions. The queen had no independent voice in these proceedings. Her innocence mattered less than the political advantage gained by removing her. Once the king's brow tightened in displeasure, events progressed as though predetermined. The most shocking part was how quickly the transformation happened. A queen might sit beside Henry at a feast, receiving compliments and enjoying music, only to wake the next morning and discover that the air had changed. A look from the king, a murmur among courtiers, a sudden absence of servants she trusted. Each sign pointed toward the shift she dreaded, even if no accusations had yet been spoken. She felt the danger closing around her. The routines that once reassured her now felt sharp-edged, unfamiliar, and cold. To survive in such an environment, a queen learned to anticipate danger before it fully formed. She measured her words with painstaking care, avoided disagreements, and watched for signals hidden in the king's tone or expression. But vigilance offered no guarantee. She could not predict which gesture or conversation might trigger suspicion. She could not prevent external forces, politics, foreign alliances, and personal resentments from influencing the king's view of her. She could only continue performing her role, aware that the final judgment belonged to a man whose emotions governed the fate of the entire court. The chilling truth was that a queen ceased to be a wife the moment Henry's loyalty wavered. She became a piece on a board, moved or removed according to strategy rather than affection. Her history with him, her years of devotion, her sacrifices meant little in the face of royal dissatisfaction. Courtiers justified each fall as a necessity, even when they recognized the injustice. Survival depended not on merit, but on remaining within the limits of the king's fleeting favor. Those who witnessed the falls of Catherine of Aragon and Anne Boleyn understood this reality deeply. Both women had once held the king's admiration, yet admiration did not protect them when his ambitions shifted. Their stories circulated quietly through the palace, serving as warnings disguised as memories. Each queen who followed stepped into a role already shaped by their tragedies, knowing that the slightest misreading of the king's expression might mark the beginning of her end. In such a place, fear became as constant as ceremony. Queen smiled, dined, and walked through the palace as though life remained steady. But beneath their composure lay a quiet dread. They understood that a single moment, a brief hesitation, a misunderstood remark, a gesture observed out of context, could become the spark that set their downfall in motion. Her vulnerability revealed how quickly safety disappeared under the weight of royal impatience. Beyond this warning lies the struggle of a queen whose only protection came from fulfilling a single, impossible demand. In that struggle, the boundary between hope and despair begins to thin. Jane Seymour's time, beside Henry VIII, unfolded quietly, shaped more by restraint than boldness. Those who watched her arrival at court noticed how different she seemed from the women who came before her. She moved with a soft caution, spoke with measured calm, and rarely drew attention to herself. Yet these qualities, so understated, became the very reasons Henry gravitated toward her. In a court shaken by conflict and scandal, Jane offered the appearance of steadiness, a presence that soothed rather than provoked. Her gentleness was not submission, it was survival shaped into behaviour. She stepped into queenship bearing the weight of the king's desire for peace and for an heir. The expectations placed on her were immense, though she carried them silently. Courtiers speculated that Henry looked to her not just for companionship, but for restoration, someone who might lift the shadow of disappointment that had grown over the palace. Jane understood this pressure, even if she rarely acknowledged it aloud. Her duty was clear, and she accepted it with a quiet seriousness that many mistook for passivity. Jane's relationship with Henry differed from those before her. The king treated her with a restrained tenderness, partly out of relief, partly out of hope. She never confronted him, never challenged his temper, never attempted to wield influence through force of personality. Her approach was gentler, drawing the king toward her through patience and composed loyalty. In return, Henry placed on her the hopes he had once placed on Catherine of Aragon and Anne Boleyn, the hope of a male heir who would secure the Tudor line and quiet the turmoil that had consumed the court for years. When Jane became pregnant, the palace shifted into a state of cautious optimism. Servants whispered prayers, courtiers softened their tones, and Henry hovered with a mixture of excitement and fear. Each month that passed without complication strengthened the king's pride and the court's anticipation. For the first time in years, the atmosphere around the king felt lighter. Even those who disliked Jane privately admitted that her calm presence was reshaping the emotional climate of the palace. The day she delivered a healthy son marked a turning point in Henry's life, and in England's, bells rang across the realm. Bonfires were lit, and celebrations erupted in towns and villages. Edward's birth symbolized triumph not only for the crown but for Jane herself. She had fulfilled the expectation that defined a queen's worth more than any other. But the triumph carried a hidden cost. Jane's body, weakened by a long and difficult labour, began to fail in the days that followed. Those who attended her described the shift in her condition with quiet dread. At first, she seemed merely exhausted, resting with the infant prince in her arms. Then came the fever, the pallor, and the stillness that no attendant could overlook. Physicians attempted remedies they did not fully understand. Moving around her room in anxious silence, Henry visited her often, though his presence could not steady the decline they all witnessed. Jane lingered for 12 days after the birth. Her slow deterioration, unfolding in the shadows of her greatest achievement, became a painful contradiction. She had given England its long-awaited heir, yet the price she paid for this accomplishment was her life. When she died, the court entered a mourning deeper than any it had shown for the women before her. Even those who rarely spoke her name with warmth acknowledged the tragedy of her loss. The queen who had restored hope to the realm was gone, before she could see the infant she had carried into the world begin to grow. Henry's grief for Jane was different from his reactions to Catherine and Anne. He mourned her, not with anger or justification, but with genuine sorrow. He ordered grand funerary rites, preserved her memory with reverence, and declared her his true wife. A sentiment that revealed more about his longing for stability than about the marriages that had come before. His affection for Jane grew larger in her absence, shaping her legacy into something almost idealized. Jane's brief queenship revealed a truth that lingered long after her death. Success in Henry's court came with a cost no woman could fully anticipate. She had achieved the goal that eluded those before her. But accomplishment offered no protection against the realities of childbirth or the dangers inherent in being queen. her story exposed the thin line between triumph and tragedy, between fulfilling a role and losing everything in the process. Her death marked more than the end of a marriage. It marked the unraveling of the fragile peace she had helped create. The court, once softened by hope, returned to its familiar tension as uncertainty took hold again. The infant prince symbolized future stability. But the queen, who had brought him into the world, was no longer there to anchor the king's volatile nature. Jane's life demonstrated that even the greatest victory a queen could offer, Henry demanded a sacrifice far greater than anyone wished to admit. She satisfied the king's deepest desire and yet paid the ultimate price, in a realm where queens were measured by what they could provide rather than who they were. Jane's story stood as a quiet reminder that survival and success were never the same thing. Her fragile triumph showed how even perfect fulfillment carried fatal consequences. Beyond her loss emerges the story of a woman who lived by escaping expectations rather than meeting them. Within that escape, a different kind of survival begins to take shape. Anne of Cleves entered Henry VIII's court with expectations shaped not by her own intentions but by the politics that arranged her marriage. She travelled from Germany, believing she would become the Queen of England, a role she prepared for with careful composure and a willingness to adapt. Yet the moment Henry met her, everything shifted. His disappointment was immediate, sharp, and unfiltered. He found her appearance unappealing, a judgment he made before she even had the chance to speak. Those who observed the meeting sensed the tension instantly. The king's enthusiasm faltered, and Anne's fate began to transform into something neither she nor her advisers anticipated. Despite the king's reaction, Anne approached her new role with quiet dignity. She understood the alliance between her family and England was the true purpose of her marriage, and she tried to fulfill her obligations with patience. But Henry's opinion of her did not change. His dissatisfaction coloured every interaction, shaping a marriage that felt strained from the beginning. The court noticed how he avoided her presence, how he spoke of her with frustration, and how little interest he showed in building a life with her. These observations grew into whispers that drifted through hallways and chambers, forming a narrative Anne could not escape. Even so, she remained calm. Unlike Catherine of Aragon or Anne Boleyn, she did not attempt to assert influence or charm the king. She simply continued her duties. Aware that her position was precarious, but unwilling to create conflict, her restraint became her shield. While the king's irritation might have destroyed another queen, Anne's quiet acceptance of the situation seemed to disarm the hostility around her. She did not challenge Henry, did not accuse him, and did not attempt to reshape circumstances she knew she could not control. When Henry decided to end the marriage, Anne faced the news with a composure that surprised those around her. She agreed to the annulment, acknowledging the official claim that their union had not been properly consummated. Her willingness to step aside without protest changed the atmosphere of the court entirely. Instead of becoming an adversary, she became a figure of sympathy and respect. Henry, relieved by her compliance, began to view her with a warmth he had never shown during their marriage. The king's gratitude manifested in ways that reshaped Anne's life. He granted her the honorary title, the King's Sister, a distinction that allowed her to remain in England with financial security and personal freedom. She received estates, to servants, and independence, privileges unusual for a former queen. Her relationship with Henry transformed into something more stable than their marriage had ever been. They exchanged gifts, visited each other, and spoke with comfort rather than tension. Observers found the irony striking. The woman Henry rejected as a wife became one of the few individuals he treated with consistent respect. Anne embraced her new life with a sense of relief. She no longer carried the expectations placed on a queen, yet she retained the benefits of royal connection. Her homes became places of calm routine, free from the political storms that had consumed the court. She learned English customs, built friendships with members of the royal household, and even maintained a cordial relationship with Henry's children. Her presence in England evolved into something steady, unthreatening, and quietly admirable. Her survival contrasted sharply with the fates of the women who came before and after her. Catherine of Aragon faced exile, Anne Boleyn faced execution, and Catherine Howard would soon face similar danger. But Anne of Cleves escaped these outcomes not through power, ambition, or influence, but through a circumstance that initially appeared unfortunate: the king's distaste, so humiliating in the moment, became the very factor that saved her life. By not stirring Henry's desire, she avoided his volatility. By not provoking him, she avoided punishment. Her perceived plainness became an unexpected refuge in a court where beauty could be as dangerous as betrayal. Anne's story revealed a truth that unsettled many who reflected on it. Survival in Henry's world did not depend solely on virtue or intelligence. It depended on chance, timing, and the king's unpredictable emotions. Anne succeeded because she entered the palace at a moment when Henry's rage had cooled. After all, she did not challenge his authority, and because she accepted circumstances with humility that disarmed political threats. Her life demonstrated that sometimes the safest place in Henry's England was at the margin of his attention, not the centre of his desire. Though she never ruled as a beloved queen, Anne became something rarer, a woman who lived out her days unscathed. She watched as queens rose and fell around her, each rise steep, each fall devastating, and she quietly maintained her place in the shadow of the court. Her distance from power became her protection. Her unassuming presence allowed her to endure. Anne's fate showed that not every woman who entered Henry's world was destined for tragedy. Some survived by stepping aside, by understanding that influence was not always worth the cost, and by accepting a life of stability rather than reaching for a crown that could destroy them. Her quiet escape revealed how survival often favored those who refused to fight for the center of the king's gaze. Beyond her safety lies a far more perilous tale shaped by youth, desire, and danger intertwined. From that peril, another queen's downfall begins to gather its weight. Catherine Howard entered Henry VIII's world with the bright, unsteady energy of youth. She was barely 16, raised in an environment where supervision was inconsistent and guidance often absent. When she appeared at court, she carried no grand political ambitions. She simply moved with the lightness of someone who had not yet learned to fear the consequences of being noticed. Henry, older and increasingly desperate for warmth and admiration, he saw in her a vision of youth that revived something he believed he had lost. Her laughter, her softness, and her polite eagerness created a brief illusion of renewal for a king worn down by disappointment. Her elevation to queen happened quickly. Courtiers saw how the king's mood shifted whenever she entered a room, how he watched her not with calculation, but with a longing shaped by age and insecurity. Catherine did not resist the attention. She did not yet grasp the weight that would come with it. Becoming queen might have seemed like a reward, but the role demanded skills she had never been taught. She stepped into a world filled with hidden expectations and silent dangers. A world where every gesture could be interpreted as a strategy, even when no strategy existed in her mind. Catherine's past, once irrelevant, became her greatest vulnerability. Before her marriage, she had engaged in youthful relationships, interactions shaped more by inexperience than desire. These moments, harmless in another setting, turned into weapons when she became queen. People who had once shared her company now held fragments of her past that could be twisted into accusations. The court, skilled at turning secrets into leverage, waited for the chance to use these memories in ways Catherine could not anticipate. Her marriage to Henry revealed her lack of preparation for political life. She offered the king affection, kind words, and gentle attention, but she could not give him the strategic awareness he expected from a queen. Henry adored her, but he also watched her with the insecurity of a man terrified of betrayal. Catherine, inexperienced in managing such scrutiny, continued to behave with the openness of someone who had never been taught to hide. Her innocence made her seem careless, and her lack of caution made her an easy target. Rumours began to circulate about her friendship with Thomas Culpeper, a young courtier whose charm made him popular among the Queen's attendants. Their interactions, observed by servants and twisted through gossip, became fuel for suspicion. Catherine likely believed she was navigating ordinary companionship, unaware that even simple familiarity could be interpreted as disloyalty. To those who sought influence, her youthful behaviour became an opportunity. They whispered, documented, and suggested impropriety in ways that reshaped the court's perception of her. When accusations surfaced, they came with a force Catherine could not withstand. Officials interrogated her former acquaintances, pulling confessions from frightened individuals who knew their own safety depended on cooperation. The stories they told painted Catherine as reckless, deceptive, and immoral, descriptions that exaggerated her past and distorted her intentions. The king, already sensitive to the idea of infidelity after Anne Boleyn's fall, reacted with a mixture of heartbreak and fury. The betrayal he felt was not entirely rational, but emotional wounds rarely follow logic. Catherine's arrest stunned her. She had never imagined her behaviour would be interpreted as treason. She lacked the political sense to anticipate how her past would be used against her, or how every action she took as queen carried consequences far greater than she understood. Witnesses later described her confusion during questioning, her inability to grasp the severity of her situation, and her desperate attempts to explain actions that had no strategic motive behind them. She was not a schemer, she was a teenager, caught in a system designed to punish innocence as harshly as wrongdoing. As her trial approached, the court observed her decline with a mixture of pity and detachment. She moved through the tower like someone who had aged years in a matter of days. Her youth, once the source of her charm, became a reminder of how unprepared she had been for the role she accepted. Even those who disliked her could not deny the tragedy of her situation. A girl placed in a position she never understood, punished by a world that demanded sophistication she never possessed. Henry did not attend her execution. His absence was both expected and telling. He had once adored her with the enthusiasm of a man seeking comfort. But when disappointment struck, he distanced himself in ways that revealed the instability of his affections. Catherine walked to the scaffold alone, carrying the weight of accusations she could neither fight nor fully comprehend. Her final words reflected a mixture of sorrow and resignation, shaped by the recognition that she had never been equipped to survive the world she entered. Her story exposed a harsh truth. Youth offered no protection in Henry's court. Inexperience became a liability. Vulnerability became evidence. And past mistakes, no matter how ordinary, became grounds for destruction when viewed through the lens of royal insecurity. Catherine's fall was not the result of ambition or manipulation. It was the result of a system that punished naivety as harshly as betrayal. Her death marked yet another reminder that the crown Henry offered was never simply a symbol of honour. It was a burden, a trap, and for some, a sentence delivered before they even understood its meaning. Her brief reign revealed how innocence could be twisted into danger under the weight of suspicion. Beyond her tragedy rises the story of a woman who learned to survive by outthinking the king himself. Out of that quiet intelligence, a final queen steps forward to navigate peril with calculation rather than youth. Catherine Parr entered Henry VIII's court, not with youthful brightness or seductive charm, but with a kind of measured steadiness, shaped by years of observing how power consumed others. She was older than most queens before her, widowed twice, and familiar with the fragile nature of safety in noble circles. When she became Henry's sixth wife, she did so with a clarity none of his earlier consorts possessed. She understood that the king was aging, ill, unpredictable, and surrounded by factions eager to influence his judgment. She also understood that survival depended on navigating these dangers with careful restraint rather than force. Her intelligence did not shine in dramatic gestures, but in quiet, deliberate choices. Catherine approached her role as queen with the mindset of a caretaker rather than a romantic partner. Henry's health had deteriorated sharply. His leg ulcers, his weight, and the strain of decades of political and emotional conflict made him volatile and often impatient. She tended to him with calm patience, offering conversation that soothed rather than inflamed. Her presence reassured him, and in return, he granted her a degree of trust, unusual for a man who had executed 2 wives and discarded 3. This trust, however, was not unconditional. Catherine understood that even a devoted caretaker could fall from favour if she misjudged his mood or challenged him at the wrong moment. Unlike other queens, Catherine used her position to promote learning, religious discussion, and intellectual inquiry. She read widely, debated respectfully, and surrounded herself with scholars. But this curiosity, admired by some, alarmed others. England was shifting between religious identities, and Catherine's inclination toward reform placed her in a dangerous position. Courtiers who favoured more conservative beliefs watched her closely, collecting her words like potential weapons. They knew that Henry's opinions could shift quickly, and that a single misinterpreted conversation might cost her everything. Her intelligence became both her strength and her risk. Henry appreciated her ability to engage him in thoughtful conversation, especially when illness or frustration clouded his judgment. But he also bristled when he felt she challenged him. Even subtly, Catherine learned to read these reactions with precision. She softened her tone when the king grew weary, redirected conversations that turned too sharp, and occasionally stepped back entirely when she sensed danger. Her survival depended on these adjustments, on knowing when to speak and when silence carried more safety. Despite her caution, enemies at court sought opportunities to undermine her. They fed Henry selective information, suggesting that Catherine's religious discussions bordered on heresy. They implied that her influence threatened stability, framing her intellect as ambition rather than curiosity. These whispers, repeated with practiced subtlety, began to take root. For a brief but terrifying period, Henry entertained the possibility that his queen might indeed be a danger. The machinery that had sealed the fate of previous queens stirred again. Though quietly at first, Catherine felt the shift before anyone said a word. The king's tone changed. The warmth in his eyes faded, and her attendants moved with a tension they could not conceal. Documents were drafted for her arrest. Plans were made to interrogate her. Charges were prepared that would place her on the same path that led Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard to the scaffold. But Catherine did not panic. Instead, she turned to the only tool that had ever truly protected her, her understanding of the king. When Henry confronted her, she replied, not with defiance, but with humility. She insisted that her discussions on religion were meant to comfort him, not to teach him. She claimed she had spoken only to distract him from pain and to show loyalty, not to question authority. Her words reframed the accusations without contradicting the king, restoring his sense of superiority. Henry, moved by her explanation, and perhaps ashamed of how quickly suspicion had taken hold, withdrew the order for her arrest. Those who had plotted against her watched their plans collapse in front of them, undone not by force, but by Catherine's instinct for survival. This moment defined her legacy. She did not escape danger because she was protected. She escaped because she recognized how fear, pride, and insecurity shaped the king's decisions. She lived not by avoiding risk, but by anticipating it. And she offered Henry something he valued deeply in his final years: stability without confrontation. Catherine remained queen until Henry's death, surviving where others had fallen. She guided his children with care, cultivated a household built on learning, and maintained dignity in a court known for cruelty. After Henry's passing, she remarried for love, claiming a happiness she had long been denied. Yet freedom came with its own complications, and her new life would not be without pain. Still, she remained the only one among Henry's wives who left his reign alive, a testament not to luck, but to her deliberate, measured wisdom. Her story revealed that in a world where queens were often destroyed by desire, youth, or defiance, true survival required something quieter, an understanding of power so precise that it allowed her to navigate danger without ever appearing to resist it. Her narrow escape showed how knowledge, not boldness, could steady a queen's path through the king's shifting moods. Beyond her survival stands the final reckoning of a reign shaped by tragedy, ambition, and loss. Through that reckoning, the true cost of Henry's 6 marriages begins to sharpen against history's memory. Queens in Henry VIII's England did not enter marriage with the freedom to shape their own futures. Their personal wishes, private fears, and individual identities mattered far less than the political weight they carried the moment they accepted the crown. Each queen stepped into a role already defined by alliances, expectations, and calculations made by men who never considered how little control she would retain over her own life. In Henry's world, marriage was not an intimate union. It was an instrument of statecraft, a negotiation between nations, families, and ambitions. A queen might wear jewels and walk before crowds, but the life beneath that splendor was shaped almost entirely by forces outside her control. Love rarely guided these unions. The king's desire could spark attention, but desire was temporary, fading as quickly as it ignited. What lasted were the political benefits the marriage provided: strengthened alliances, claims to territory, reassurance to powerful families, or gestures designed to project authority. A queen who understood this dynamic quickly learned that the affection shown to her in public had little to do with her as a person. She was admired for what she represented, not for who she was. Her smiles were evaluated as political signals, her gestures interpreted as strategic, and her body treated as a vessel for the future of the realm. The pressure to produce an heir overshadowed every moment of her life. A son meant security, validation, and temporary peace. A daughter or a miscarriage meant uncertainty, disappointment, and potential danger. The queen's body became an arena on which the kingdom projected its hopes and its anxieties. She lived under constant scrutiny, her health monitored, her appetite questioned, her movements interpreted as signs of pregnancy or failure. Even her emotions were watched, as if fear or stress might jeopardize the future she was expected to guarantee. Her body was not her own. It belonged to the crown, the court, and the man who ruled them. This loss of autonomy extended into every aspect of her daily existence. A queen could not choose her companions freely. Her ladies-in-waiting were assigned by political factions. She could not decide where she travelled. Her movements were determined by the king's will. Even her private conversations could be distorted once passed through the maze of courtiers eager to gain favour. Every relationship she built was filtered through suspicion or ambition, leaving her with little space for genuine trust. In such an environment, loneliness became as constant as ceremony. The expectations surrounding virtue added yet another burden. A queen was expected to embody moral perfection, a symbol of purity and obedience. Her clothing, speech, and behaviour were judged with relentless attention. A misinterpreted glance, an accidental touch, or a rumour whispered by a servant could threaten her reputation. Meanwhile, the king himself lived free of such standards, his desires openly accommodated, his infidelities excused as political necessity. The double standard was clear. A queen's honour shaped the stability of the realm, but the king's conduct shaped only the stories told about him. Queens also became symbols in political struggles they did not initiate. When factions within the court fought for influence, they used the Queen's standing to strengthen their arguments. If she maintained favour with the king, they attached themselves to her. If she fell out of favour, they abandoned her with startling speed. Her alliances shifted, not because she changed her position, but because others recalculated theirs. She existed at the centre of conflicts she rarely controlled, blamed for missteps she never made, and praised for successes that often concealed deeper tensions. The cruelest part of her role was how easily she could be replaced. No matter how devoted she was, no matter how well she performed her duties, her safety depended entirely on the king's shifting perception. The crown she wore one day could become a weight, dragging her toward isolation or even execution. 2 queens had already died under Henry's command, their bodies offered as proof of their alleged betrayal. Others had been cast aside, exiled, or humiliated. A queen did not escape danger by following rules. She navigated danger simply by existing within a system where the rules could change without warning. Even queens who served dutifully understood that their survival required constant vigilance. They adapted to Henry's moods, softened their voices when necessary, and avoided expressing opinions that might challenge his authority. They lived with the knowledge that their choices were not truly theirs. The court interpreted their actions. The king judged their worth. And history eventually recorded their stories through layers of political bias. What remained consistent across the lives of all 6 queens was the stark truth that no woman, regardless of her strength or virtue, possessed complete control of her own life once she entered Henry's orbit. Their bodies, their marriages, and their reputations belonged to something larger and colder than personal affection. They belonged to the machinery of monarchy, a system built on lineage, stability, image, and power. The queens were expected to carry that machinery on their shoulders while smiling before crowds, producing heirs, and demonstrating unwavering loyalty. Their private suffering remained hidden behind layers of ceremonial grandeur, their personal sacrifices overshadowed by the demands placed upon them. If they faltered, they were replaced. If they succeeded, they were celebrated briefly before pressure returned. Their victories were temporary. Their failures could be fatal. In the end, the crown offered them visibility, not freedom. Their constrained lives revealed how queenship stripped autonomy, even as it bestowed glory. Beyond that confinement rises the darker truth of how intimacy itself became evidence in a court driven by suspicion. By that shadowed tension, a deeper cost of Tudor power begins to surface. In Henry VIII's court, intimacy was never private. Every gesture, every glance, every movement between a queen and anyone around her existed under constant observation. The palace functioned like a living organism whose eyes never closed. Servants watched more than they served. Ladies-in-waiting listened more than they comforted. And courtiers recorded details not out of curiosity, but out of ambition. In such a place, the Queen's personal life did not belong to her. It belonged to the crown, to political factions, and to the dangerous machinery of suspicion that shaped the fate of anyone who lived near the king. A queen could not close a door without raising questions. Her chamber, filled with attendants day and night, offered no true solitude, even the moments meant to be private. Times of rest, dressing, bathing, or quiet conversation were witnessed by others whose loyalty could shift depending on who offered them greater benefit. What should have been ordinary expressions of affection or routine activity became potential evidence. A misplaced word, a smile misinterpreted, or a single unguarded moment could be twisted into accusations that carried catastrophic consequences. Malcourtier, too, lived with this awareness. To be seen speaking alone with the Queen could become a liability. To be overheard sharing a joke or offering comfort could ignite rumours. The lines of propriety were so strict, so narrow, that even innocence could resemble impropriety if viewed by the wrong person. The Queen, surrounded by watchful eyes, learned to measure the distance between herself and others with careful precision. She knew that the court did not distinguish between truth and perception. Perception alone could destroy her. Rumour held extraordinary power in Henry's England. It did not need to be credible. It only needed to be repeated often enough to create doubt. Courtiers traded whispers the way merchants traded goods, each rumour carrying its own political value. A suggestion that the Queen was unfaithful, even if unfounded, could instantly shift alliances. Some factions used these whispers to weaken her family's influence. Others wielded them to convince Henry that replacing his queen would strengthen the realm. In this environment, the Queen's virtue became a public battleground, scrutinized and manipulated by those who stood to gain from her downfall. The Queen's sexual life, expected to produce heirs, became a matter of national concern. Her body was treated as a political tool, and her fertility as an administrative duty. When she failed to conceive a son, suspicion often followed. Some questioned her health, others questioned her loyalty. A miscarriage could be interpreted not as misfortune but as a sign of hidden sin or improper behaviour. The Queen's body became evidence long before any accusation was spoken aloud. This surveillance extended to her past as well. Relationships she had before marriage, no matter how innocent or youthful, could be resurrected and used against her. Catherine Howard's tragic fall demonstrated how the past, brought forward by frightened or opportunistic witnesses, could shape the Queen's future. A flirtation from years earlier became, under the cold gaze of the court, a sign of treason. A letter, written in confidence, became proof of deceit. What had once been private memory became public condemnation. The king himself contributed to this environment of scrutiny. Henry's insecurities grew as he aged. He feared betrayal, feared irrelevance, and feared that God judged him through his failing marriages. His desire for absolute loyalty meant that any hint of infidelity struck directly at his sense of authority. The court understood this and tailored its stories accordingly. A single whisper could sway the king's trust, and that trust, once broken, became impossible to repair. The Queen's interactions with Henry were also monitored. Her behaviour toward him, her attentiveness, her affection, her deference, was interpreted as evidence of her moral state. If she appeared distant, the court wondered why. If she appeared too cheerful, they wondered with whom she shared her joy. Even her silence could become suspicious. Intimacy with the king did not protect her. It only deepened the risk. For if Henry felt slighted, ignored, or emotionally wounded, he might seek explanations that pointed not to his own temper, but to the Queen's supposed disloyalty. Those who served the Queen were often caught in this dangerous web. Ladies-in-waiting could be interrogated, coerced, or threatened to reveal details about the Queen's private life. Their testimonies, truthful or not, could be twisted during questioning. Servants who hoped to gain influence might embellish their observations, believing the king wanted to hear confirmation of his suspicions. Others, fearing punishment, confessed to stories they had never witnessed simply to protect themselves. For the Queen, fear became a constant companion. She learned to move carefully, speak cautiously, and trust sparingly. Her emotional life narrowed into controlled expressions designed to avoid misinterpretation. Joy had to be measured, grief had to be moderated, and friendship had to be concealed beneath layers of formal distance. Love, even for the king, could not be displayed freely. It had to be performed in a way that reassured him without appearing manipulative. In such a world, intimacy did not symbolize connection, it symbolized risk. The Queen's sexuality, controlled and monitored, served as a tool of governance. Her fidelity was treated as national security. Her body was watched as if it were an extension of the throne. Every part of her identity was politicized, refined, and controlled under the relentless pressure of a system that equated purity with power and suspicion with justice. The cost of this surveillance extended beyond individual queens. It shaped the entire culture of the Tudor court, creating an atmosphere where fear outweighed trust, and where personal relationships dissolved under the weight of political necessity. Every downfall reinforced the lesson: intimacy could kill, and innocence could not save anyone once suspicion took hold. Their monitored lives revealed how the crown transformed private moments into public threats. Beyond this scrutiny stands another weapon the court wielded with equal cruelty: faith twisted into accusation. By that weapon, the next chapter of danger begins to tighten around the throne. Religion in Henry VIII's England was not a matter of personal belief. It was a battlefield where power shifted silently beneath the surface of daily court life. Every queen who entered Henry's orbit stepped into this conflict, whether she wished to or not. Her faith, her upbringing, and even her manner of prayer could become political weapons in the hands of those seeking advantage. Henry's break from the Pope, a decision born from frustration and ambition, reshaped the kingdom so violently that every queen thereafter carried its consequences on her shoulders. What began as a personal desire to end his marriage to Catherine of Aragon became a national redefinition of authority, placing the king at the centre of spiritual and political life. When Henry severed England's ties with Rome, he did more than reject papal authority. He created an ideological vacuum. Nobles, clerics, and foreign powers scrambled to interpret what the new order meant. For the queens, this transformation meant danger. Catherine of Aragon, raised in a strict Catholic tradition, became a symbol of the old faith. Her refusal to accept the annulment of her marriage was not merely personal defiance, it was framed as resistance against the transformation of England itself. Henry, needing to justify his actions, cast her aside as though her faith were rebellion. In this new religious landscape, Catherine became a casualty not of sin, but of shifting political theology. Anne Boleyn, by contrast, seemed to embody the new direction of the realm. Her sympathy toward reformist ideas made her a convenient figure for those pushing England toward Protestant influences. She became a symbol of change, of modernity, of religious realignment. But symbols are fragile, and once she failed to deliver the male heir the king expected, her religious associations became liabilities. The same theology that had elevated her could be used to condemn her. Her critics painted her interest in reform as subversion, her intelligence as manipulation, her reading habits as threats. Religion, wielded skillfully by her opponents, played a quiet role in her downfall. Jane Seymour arrived at a moment when England hung in uncertainty between opposing religious identities. Her conservatism reassured those unsettled by Anne Boleyn's reforms. Yet she did not wield her beliefs aggressively. She moved with careful intention, avoiding the traps that had ensnared her predecessors. Jane's ability to remain steady in a shifting landscape helped her maintain favour. But her death, soon after childbirth, prevented her from facing the full weight of the religious storms gathering around the throne. Anne of Cleves entered the scene as part of a Protestant alliance intended to strengthen England's ties with reformist states in Europe. Her marriage, arranged for diplomatic advantage rather than affection, reflected the strategic use of religious identity. But the alliance collapsed when Henry rejected her, and the religious motivations behind the union dissolved almost immediately. Anne, fortunate in her calm acceptance of the annulment, escaped the deeper conflict that might have destroyed another queen. Catherine Howard, young and unprepared, was caught in the religious crossfire without understanding its implications. Her downfall arose from accusations of immorality rather than theological misalignment. But the factions who attacked her used the environment of suspicion shaped by earlier religious conflicts to amplify their claims. In a court where faith and politics were intertwined, gossip gained weight easily, and Catherine became another tragic figure, crushed by forces she never understood. Catherine Parr, educated and thoughtful, walked directly into the heart of the religious conflict. She was genuinely interested in reformist ideas, reading widely and engaging in theological discussions that challenged traditional expectations of queenship. Henry admired her intellect, but admiration had limits. When conservative factions sought to eliminate her influence, they accused her of promoting dangerous doctrines. In a world where religious identity could signal loyalty or treason, Catherine Parr nearly fell victim to the same machinery that destroyed those before her. She survived only because she recognized how to redirect the king's suspicion, framing her arguments as expressions of devotion rather than theological rebellion. Behind the crown, religion functioned as a silent instrument of control. Each queen became a symbol for opposing factions: Catholic versus Protestant, tradition vs. reform, stability versus disruption. Their personal convictions mattered far less than the political value assigned to them. If a queen's beliefs aligned conveniently with the needs of those in power, she was praised as virtuous and loyal. If they did not, she became a threat. Her faith could be viewed as treason, her prayers as sedition, her silence as defiance. Religious identity became a justification for actions that had little to do with faith. Annulments, executions, and public condemnations were framed as moral necessities rather than political strategy. The court spoke of doctrine while maneuvering for influence. Bishops debated scripture, while nobles calculated their advantage. The king invoked divine authority while reshaping England according to personal desires. Behind every theological decision was a human cost, often borne by the women closest to him. Foreign powers added further complexity. Each queen brought her own ties to Spain, to German states, to reformist or conservative circles. These connections influenced diplomatic relationships and created tension within the court. A queen's faith became a signal to ambassadors and enemies, an indicator of where England might lean next. Her marriage became a statement broadcast to Europe, even when she herself had little voice in shaping its meaning. For the queens, the religious conflict was not an abstract debate. It was a daily threat, shaping their behavior, their conversations, and their chances of survival. A single book in their chamber, a misunderstood remark, a poorly timed alliance could ignite suspicion. Their spiritual lives, which should have offered solace, instead became battlegrounds where misunderstanding or malice could destroy them. The invisible war of faith in Henry's England did not simply change the kingdom. It consumed the women who stood beside the king, turning their beliefs into evidence, their identities into symbols, and their lives into sacrifices for a throne that demanded unquestioned loyalty. Their faith-bound struggles revealed how belief became both weapon and wound in the Tudor court. Beyond this spiritual conflict rises the quieter but equally dangerous arena of political rivalry and manipulation. Through that rivalry, another layer of the Queen's peril begins to unfold. Power in Henry VIII's court rarely rested in a single pair of hands. Even though the king appeared to command everything, beneath the surface, the palace was a maze of competing families, long-standing grudges, and shifting allegiances that shaped every decision made within its walls. These factions moved quietly, calculating their advantage with patience or aggression depending on the moment. For the queens, this landscape was especially dangerous. They were not only symbols of royal authority, but also potential gateways for influence. Anyone who could shape a queen's opinions, or her access to the king, could alter the balance of power in England. Families entered the court with clear ambitions. They positioned daughters as ladies-in-waiting, educated sons to serve as advisors, and cultivated alliances through gifts, flattery, and information. Behind every gesture was a purpose. and behind every purpose was the hope of gaining proximity to the king. A queen who emerged from one of these families became more than a bride. She became a vessel through which the hopes of her entire lineage flowed. When she succeeded, her family prospered. When she faltered, they suffered. This pressure followed her into every conversation, every room, every choice. The Howard family championed Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard with zeal, hoping to strengthen their political standing through marriage ties to the crown. Their ambition intensified the scrutiny placed on both women. For Anne, the expectations became suffocating as the factions supporting Catherine of Aragon fought back with equal determination. Every whisper, every rumour, every misstep was amplified by those who resented the Howard influence. When Anne fell, her family fell with her, exposing how fragile success was in this environment. Catherine Howard faced even more treacherous conditions. Young, inexperienced, and unprepared, she became the pawn of a family, eager for power but blind to the dangers surrounding her. The same relatives who celebrated her rise vanished the moment accusations surfaced. Their loyalty dissolved instantly, leaving Catherine alone in a political storm designed to crush her. Her tragedy revealed an uncomfortable truth. Families often loved the idea of royal connection more than they loved the woman who carried it. Even queens like Jane Seymour, who belonged to a more cautious and disciplined family, faced relentless internal pressure. The Seymours positioned themselves carefully, using Jane's quiet demeanour as a shield while working tirelessly behind the scenes to influence Henry's decisions. Their ambition was not loud, but it was constant. When Jane died, her family tightened their grip on the young Prince Edward, ensuring their relevance extended beyond her life. Their strategy demonstrated how political calculation often outlived the queens themselves. Anne of Cleves, though free from English family networks, entered a court where foreign alliances created tension. Some courtiers resented her presence, fearing that her German connections would shift England's religious or diplomatic direction. Others sought to use her as leverage. She became a symbol, not a participant. In conflicts she barely understood. When Henry rejected her, these factions adapted instantly, abandoning their positions and seeking new pathways to influence. Catherine Parr, intellectually gifted and politically aware, recognized the court's factional games more clearly than most queens before her. She understood the delicate balance required to avoid becoming a pawn. She maintained relationships on both sides of religious and political divides, careful never to grant one faction enough confidence to expose her to the jealousy of another. Her ability to navigate these tensions contributed to her survival, but even she nearly fell victim to plots made in her absence. The Queen's greatest vulnerability came from those who pretended to serve them. Ladies-in-waiting and favoured companions often arrived in their chambers with loyalties bound to external agendas. These women listened, observed, and occasionally repeated what they heard to their families or directly to the king. A queen who believed she could trust her attendants often found that her closest circle was penetrated by factions using information as currency. The difference between friendship and manipulation blurred until the queen could no longer distinguish genuine affection from strategic deception. Isolation became a common experience for queens who failed to manage factional expectations. Once suspicion formed around them, whether through loss of favour, religious tension, or political missteps, the courtiers who once praised them stepped back. This withdrawal was not subtle. Conversations faded when they entered a room. Letters slowed. Invitations stopped. The queen became a figure observed at a distance, trapped in a palace filled with people, yet profoundly alone. That loneliness made her vulnerable to further attacks. For isolation implied weakness, and weakness invited exploitation. Henry's central position amplified these factional dangers. His shifting moods, desires, and loyalties meant that courtiers adjusted themselves constantly to remain in favour. When the king admired a queen, factions supported her. When he questioned her, factions abandoned her instantly. Queens became tools of political maneuvering, valued only as long as they offered access to the king. Once they lost that influence, they lost their protection, and their fall became a spectacle watched by those who waited for the next rise of fortune. No queen could escape this environment entirely. They entered the palace as symbols of alliance, but lived within its walls as targets of ambition. Their movements were read as signals, their friendships as alliances, their fears as opportunities. The court did not destroy queens through violence alone. It destroyed them through pressure, manipulation, and the relentless pursuit of power. Their entanglement in factional rivalry revealed how queenship became a battlefield disguised as courtly service. Beyond this political tension lies a harsher reality of personal betrayal and shifting loyalties. In that deepening fracture, the hidden loneliness of Tudor queens begins to take form. No queen under Henry VIII ever walked into a room without wondering who had already spoken her name before she arrived. The sense of being watched was not a brief concern, but a condition that shaped every hour of her life. People moved quietly, nodded politely, and served dutifully. Yet behind each gesture existed a possibility that something would be carried away, repeated, bent into another meaning. A queen could smile, and someone would report that her smile looked forced. She could frown, and someone would say she disapproved of the king's judgment. Nothing belonged to her, not even the way her face shifted during a moment she barely noticed. Ladies in waiting stood closest to her, dressing her, accompanying her, shadowing her in corridors. They seemed loyal, but most of them were chosen by the court, not by the queen. Some were placed there to listen, some to observe, and some simply wanted to protect their own futures. They understood that a misplaced word could damage them more than the queen. So many chose caution by reporting everything they saw. Silence was never protection. Silence was suspicion. Speaking too much was also suspicious. Every woman around the queen understood that survival depended on offering information before being accused of hiding it. Even the queen's family could not be trusted without hesitation. The alliances that brought her into the palace were the same alliances that could destroy her if circumstances changed. Families wanted influence, titles, marriages, and access to the king. If a queen no longer benefited them, they could shift loyalties without apology. They might reassure her with letters or supportive visits. But these reassurances were often masks covering their calculations. A queen could look at her own sister or cousin and see someone who would abandon her the moment another family gained advantage at court. This tension followed her into small, ordinary actions. A glance across a hall could be interpreted as a signal to an enemy. A whispered word to a servant could be stretched into a conspiracy. A pause before answering a question might be described as hesitation rooted in guilt. Court officials were skilled at turning daily gestures into political material. In this environment, even good intentions became dangerous. A queen who showed kindness to someone unpopular risked being linked to that person's missteps. A queen who ignored someone influential risked being accused of defiance. The king's unpredictable nature intensified all of this. When Henry favoured a queen, reports about her softened or disappeared. When he grew distant, the same reports returned with sharper angles. Everyone adjusted their behaviour accordingly. People praised her loudly when they believed Henry admired her. When Henry's interest weakened, the court shifted its weight in another direction. No queen could control this movement, yet she was held responsible for its consequences. Her position might depend on the king's mood on a single morning, and that mood would ripple through every chamber of the palace. In such conditions, most queens learned to speak less, to watch more carefully, and to keep their thoughts locked behind a composed expression. This did not guarantee safety, but it slowed the flow of rumours that could harm them. They lived with the understanding that any misplaced word could open a new line of accusation, and any perceived closeness to someone could endanger both of them. Distance became a tool. Restraint became a habit. The loneliness that followed was not chosen, but it felt safer than trusting the wrong person. Behind closed doors, the weight of this isolation settled heavily. A queen might sit among beautiful fabrics, polished wood, and warm candlelight. Yet the room could feel as empty as a prison. She could hear footsteps outside her door and wonder whether they belonged to a friend, a spy, or someone who would later testify against her. Meals, conversations, and celebrations all carried an invisible pressure. Her life required constant caution, not because she was disloyal, but because loyalty had no defense against suspicion. There were moments when a queen might believe she had found someone she could rely on. Perhaps a lady-in-waiting who seemed genuinely gentle, or a distant cousin who behaved with unusual honesty. But these small hopes rarely survived the reality of court life. When power shifted, people adjusted instantly. They protected themselves, not the queen. Bonds that seemed real could dissolve within days. Even kindness could be reinterpreted as manipulation. The queen remained at the center of a fragile circle that cracked easily and often without warning. Rumors did not need to be plausible to be dangerous. A careless comment about her health might be turned into a story about her inability to bear children. A routine conversation with a courtier could be reshaped into evidence of inappropriate closeness. A letter she never wrote might be used against her because it served someone's political goals. Once a rumor started, it spread quickly and lodged in the king's mind. By the time the queen heard it, its damage had already begun. These pressures left queens with an understanding that they were always standing on uncertain ground. Their position depended on people they could not choose, conversations they could not control, and interpretations they could not correct. They learned to move carefully, speak cautiously, and hope that being quiet enough, obedient enough, and distant enough might allow them to survive another day. It was not a guarantee. It was only a strategy. In the Tudor court, strategies often failed. Their isolation revealed how queens lived, surrounded by people, yet trusted no one. Beyond that uneasy silence rises the truth that a crown offered visibility but never safety. Under that harsh truth, the shadow of the executioner begins to drift closer. Standing inside the great halls of Henry VIII's palaces, one would notice how the air carried a pressure that never lifted. The title of queen did not protect anyone from that weight. It only made the edges sharper. The crown offered visibility, luxury, and ceremony. But it also brought a danger that settled into daily routines and quiet moments. The polished floors, the carved ceilings, and the guarded doors all reflected the same truth. The life of a queen could end not through illness or accident, but through the king's decision alone. Execution was not an unfamiliar outcome. Two of Henry's queens walked directly toward the scaffold under public judgment. Their deaths were staged events designed to reassure the people. They were told that justice had been carried out. They were encouraged to believe that the kingdom had been protected. Yet the deeper reality was less structured. These executions did not grow from well-investigated crimes. They grew from dissatisfaction, fear, political advantage, and the king's shifting emotions. A queen did not have to be guilty. She only had to lose usefulness. When whispers grew or alliances shifted, the balance around her weakened. The same crown that elevated her became an object that defined her vulnerability. Once doubts reached the king, even a queen with no misconduct could be placed under watch. The court did not defend her. The advisors did not question the accusations. The process unfolded because it was expected to unfold. The palace staff observed the transitions long before the public saw any sign. Reduced access, colder greetings, increased supervision, and small changes in daily routine signaled that a queen's stability had fractured. Her meals might be monitored more carefully. Her letters might be examined. Her ladies might be replaced. Each alteration was subtle, but together they created an atmosphere she could not mistake. Inside this environment, Fear lived quietly. A queen continued her duties, attended ceremonies, and greeted ambassadors. But each action was performed with awareness that her safety depended on maintaining the king's approval. She could not challenge accusations. She could not appeal to a higher authority. She could not seek counsel outside the court. Her life, her reputation, and her future rested entirely in the hands of the man who had placed the crown on her head. Public executions served a purpose beyond punishment. They reinforced the belief that the king acted with fairness and strength. They created an image of order. Crowds gathered with curiosity rather than sympathy. They watched the condemned queen walk forward, steady or trembling, and saw not a woman losing her life, but a symbol being removed from the structure of power. The spectacle allowed people to distance themselves emotionally. It was easier to believe the queen had committed serious crimes than to accept that her death resulted from political convenience. Within the court, reactions stayed controlled. Those who had served the condemned queen adjusted their positions quickly. No one wanted to appear too loyal. No one wanted to be seen defending her. When the king shifted favor, the entire court shifted with him. Security replaced comfort. Distance replaced familiarity. The queen who once shaped ceremonies now faced the realization that she had no defenders strong enough to challenge the direction of her fate. A queen's final days revealed the limits of her influence. Her titles, jewels, and alliances could not slow the progression toward her execution. She had occupied the highest female position in the kingdom. Yet she met the same end as any common criminal sentenced by the crown. Her downfall became a reminder to everyone, including future queens. That status did not protect them. It only amplified the consequences of failure. This reality shaped how queens lived long before accusations emerged. They monitored their expressions, their conversations, their correspondence, and their associations. They measured every gesture. They avoided giving attention to rumors. They understood that even silence could be interpreted as disloyalty. Their daily lives became balancing acts performed under intense observation. The crown rested lightly on their heads, always at risk of being lifted away. 2 queens reached the block, but the shadow touched all 6. Even those who survived carried the memory of the danger. They had watched others rise and fall. They had seen how quickly admiration transformed into suspicion. They had learned that no explanation, no plea, and no achievement could fully protect them from the king's changing priorities. To live as queen under Henry VIII was to stand near a threshold that offered no warning before opening. The machinery of accusation moved without resistance. The verdict carried the weight of absolute authority. The execution served as a closure, arranged for public confidence rather than personal justice. Those who witnessed these events understood that the scaffold did not appear suddenly. It formed through weeks of shifting glances, dans silence, and nervous observations. The queen sensed its presence even before the charges were spoken. She recognized the pattern because she had seen it unfold around others. Her crown was the symbol that made her visible. Her vulnerability was the truth that defined her existence. The threat surrounding each queen marked their lives more deeply than any ceremony could conceal. Beyond that threat rises of the uneasy recognition that their children shaped political risks as much as political hopes. Along with that recognition grows the fear of how motherhood could decide a queen's fate. Walking through the Tudor court, one would notice how the presence of children shaped the atmosphere as much as the politics. A royal child was never only a child. That simple fact followed every queen from the moment she entered the palace. Her body, her health, and her future rested on the fragile uncertainty of childbirth. A queen's relevance could rise or collapse based on the sex of the infant she carried. And she knew this long before her confinement began. No ritual, no prayer, and no medical care during the period could guarantee success. The entire kingdom waited for a result she could not control. The demand for a male heir was constant and unyielding. Producing a son was seen not only as a blessing, but as confirmation of the queen's worth. A daughter, however healthy or intelligent, did not secure stability. The line of succession required certainty, and certainty meant a male child. Henry VIII's fear of dynastic collapse shaped every expectation placed upon his wives. Their pregnancies were monitored with attention that resembled inspection rather than care. Servants listened at the door. Advisors whispered calculations. The court prepared for celebrations or disappointment long before the outcome was known. This pressure altered how queens moved through their days. Every misstep, every sign of fatigue, every moment of emotional strain could be interpreted as affecting the unborn child. When miscarriages occurred, and they often did, whispers formed quickly. Some blamed stress. Some blamed fate. Others quietly blamed the queen. The loss of a pregnancy carried personal grief, but the court treated it as a political failure. Conversations changed. Glances sharpened. The queen understood the shift before anyone spoke openly about it. Children became political pieces as soon as they entered the world. A son strengthened his mother's position. A daughter weakened it. The king's affection could warm or cool depending on the infant's sex. Anne Boleyn learned this with devastating speed. Catherine of Aragon had learned it long before her. Each queen recognized that her child's existence, something intimate and deeply personal, was interpreted as a strategic advantage or liability. There was no separation between motherhood and political survival. Even a royal childhood did not provide safety. Children were kept close to the court, yet separated from their parents. Their education, attendant, and daily activities were arranged by political purpose rather than familial comfort. A queen had limited influence over how her child was raised. Decisions about tutors, households, and alliances were made by the king and his advisors. When a queen favoured a particular servant or noble family for her child's care, the choice could be interpreted as forming a faction. When she expressed concern about her child's well-being, it could be seen as interfering. Every gesture held weight. For some queens, their children became bargaining chips. A son could buy time, protection, and patience from the king. A daughter could be used in marriage negotiations, tying the kingdom to foreign alliances. But the value of these relationships shifted constantly with the political winds. A change in diplomacy could reduce a child's usefulness. A disagreement with a noble house could place the child in the center of conflict. The queen, who should have been the child's shield, was often powerless to prevent these shifts. The vulnerability created by childbirth extended beyond the mother's lifetime. Catherine Parr, though she survived Henry, faced complications from childbirth that ended her life soon after. Her daughter entered the world at the cost of her mother's survival. The tragedy demonstrated how even queens, protected by rank and wealth, could not escape the dangers of pregnancy in their era. The court noted her death with respect, but the political structure around her remained unchanged. Children could also be used against their mothers. When accusations formed, the presence of a child did not soften the king's judgment. Anne Boleyn's daughter, the future Elizabeth I, did not prevent the queen's execution. Catherine Howard's youth and lack of children did not spare her. Yet her childlessness was used to argue that she held no true place in the kingdom's future. The absence of an heir could be transformed into a justification for removal. The court accepted these transitions with practiced silence. Queens understood that their children, meant to be sources of comfort, could heighten their fear. A healthy son could delay danger, but not erase it. A fragile daughter could hasten suspicion. Even in moments of tenderness, the shadow of political consequence lingered. A queen watching her child play in a sunlit chamber also watched her own fate reflected in the small figure's future role in the monarchy. That link was impossible to ignore. The court's corridors echoed with reminders that motherhood was never private. Nurses, midwives, and attendants all reported their observations to higher authorities. The king received updates not only about the child's health but also about the queen's emotions. Any sign of distress could be reinterpreted as instability. Any sign of confidence could be framed as ambition. The queen moved through these assessments without the ability to challenge them. The lives of the queens intertwined with their children in ways that offered neither peace nor promise. Their bodies produced heirs, but their futures depended on forces beyond their reach. They held their children close, knowing that a single birth could secure a position or destroy it entirely. Their struggle with motherhood revealed how deeply survival depended on forces they could not shape. Beyond that struggle comes the sharper burden of reputation, where whispers carried more danger than weapons. Amid those whispers rises the question of how a queen's image determined whether she lived or fell. Walking through the Tudor court, one would quickly notice that reputation functioned like an invisible structure holding everything in place. It shaped conversation, defined alliances, and determined how a queen was perceived long before anyone spoke openly about her. Reputation did not belong to the queen herself. It belonged to the people who observed her, discussed her, and judged her without hesitation. A single rumor, spoken casually or strategically, could move through the palace faster than any official decree. Once released, it grew new meanings as it traveled, leaving the queen powerless to contain or correct it. A queen's standing rested not on her actions, but on the interpretations of others. Even gestures meant to express kindness could be twisted into suggestions of ambition. A neutral glance could be taken as arrogance. A moment of silence could be framed as disloyalty. The court's ability to reshape behavior into accusation was constant. Those observing her often did so with motives that reached deeper than curiosity. Some sought advancement, some feared losing influence, and some simply understood that aligning with shifting power was essential to survival. Reputation also changed according to the king's mood. When Henry favoured a queen, the court praised her. When his interest declined, the court's opinions shifted just as quickly. Approval turned into scrutiny. Admiration turned into suspicion. Behaviour once considered acceptable suddenly became grounds for criticism. This instability meant that a queen's public image remained fragile regardless of her conduct. Her status depended entirely on a structure she could not direct or defend. The danger intensified whenever political tensions rose. Advisors and courtiers understood how effectively a rumour could weaken a queen's position. They recognized that Henry valued justification, even if it required fabrication. A whisper about impropriety could grow into a formal accusation. A comment about discontent could evolve into a claim of treason. The queen became the subject of narratives she did not write, shaping her future in ways she could not influence. Every queen lived under this pressure. Catherine of Aragon faced doubts about her usefulness when she could no longer produce a male heir. Anne Boleyn, once celebrated, became the target of rumours that painted her as reckless and unrestrained. Catherine Howard's past was reframed into a scandal that defined her downfall. Each case illustrated how reputation moved faster than truth. The court did not wait for evidence. It responded to perception. Once the king accepted a narrative, even partially, the outcome became clear. Within the palace walls, information did not stay contained. Servants, guards, ladies-in-waiting, and messengers all played roles in spreading impressions. Their observations, sometimes innocent and sometimes calculated, fed into a larger structure of judgment. A queen could maintain perfect composure, yet still fall victim to interpretations that suited the court's needs. Those closest to her, people she trusted, were often the first to report her words or gestures to others. Loyalty could shift without warning. The queen's attempts to manage her image offered little protection. She could speak carefully, avoid conflict, and show respect to every faction, yet still find herself cast in a role chosen for her by others. The palace valued narratives that supported political convenience. If Henry sought to replace a queen, her reputation justified Advisors simply supplied the necessary framing. Her status transformed into a problem needing resolution. The court adjusted accordingly. The rumour gained strength because it did not require accuracy. People believed what aligned with their expectations or interests. Once a queen was viewed as unstable, ambitious, or disloyal, every action reinforced that image, regardless of intent. Misinterpretations accumulated, forming an argument against her before she even realized she was being evaluated. Facts mattered less than the momentum of opinion. This vulnerability isolated the queens. They could not speak openly. They could not express frustration or fear. Even confiding in a trusted attendant carried risks. A misplaced word might reach someone eager to use it as evidence. Silence became safer, though it rarely protected them. Their reputations continued to evolve without their participation, shaped by the conversations occurring in rooms they never entered. Reputation also determined how the public responded to royal decisions. When Henry sought to replace a wife, he relied on narratives that portrayed her as unfit. These stories justified his actions to the kingdom. The people heard simplified versions of court events, shaped to preserve the appearance of order. They accepted the king's decisions because the queen's reputation had already been weakened. Her removal seemed reasonable rather than abrupt. The execution of Anne Boleyn, the annulment of Catherine of Aragon, and the condemnation of Catherine Howard all depended on controlling public perception. The queens understood this structure. They recognized how little control they held over their identities. They lived carefully, monitored their surroundings, and avoided unnecessary attention. Yet caution did not guarantee safety. The court transformed harmless moments into evidence of imagined wrongdoing. Once a queen became the subject of rumor, her efforts to reclaim her image rarely succeeded. She walked through the palace, knowing her survival depended not on truth, but on how convincingly others could present a version of her to the king. In the end, reputation acted as both weapon and verdict. It shaped the queen's opportunities, alliances, and dangers. It defined her rise and determined her fall. It moved ahead of her, behind her, and around her, forming judgments she could neither influence nor avoid. Their reputations revealed how survival relied less on truth than on the stories built around them. Beyond those stories lies the harsher reality that even dignity could collapse without warning. Amid that collapse grows the question of whether honor mattered at all when escape no longer existed. Moving through the Tudor court, one would notice how quickly fortunes shifted. A queen could stand at the height of ceremony one week and face isolation the next. Her status, though grand in appearance, held no protection when political winds changed. The palace corridors, filled with tapestries and guarded doors, concealed a truth understood by everyone. Elevation meant vulnerability, and the distance between power and ruin was measured in days, not years. A queen lived in constant awareness that her place at the top could collapse without warning. This collapse often began quietly. A withdrawn smile from the king, a shortened conversation, a sudden decrease in private meetings. Each sign carried weight. Courtiers noticed the change even before the queen recognized it. Their greetings grew less confident. Their presence became more formal. The queen felt the subtle withdrawal long before any official decision was made. She sensed that her standing had begun to erode, and the erosion rarely stopped once it started. When the king's dissatisfaction deepened, the consequences surfaced quickly. A queen could lose her title with a single signature. The decision did not require evidence or counsel. It required only the king's agreement with whatever justification he found convenient. One day, a queen wore her crown at court. The next, she found herself escorted away from the palace. Her rooms reassigned, her servants dismissed, and her influence erased. The speed of these transitions reflected the nature of Tudor authority: absolute, unchallenged, and final. Removal from court did not lead to safety. A queen stripped of rank lost more than luxury. She lost her identity, her security, and any protection tied to her position. Those who once bowed to her avoided her name. Those who had sought her favor now distanced themselves. She could be sent to a distant residence, watched carefully, and prevented from corresponding freely. Her movements were restricted. Her visitors required approval. She lived in confinement without the formality of chains. Yet the confinement held the same intent, to separate her from influence. For some queens, this separation became the final stage before execution. The transition from honor to condemnation could feel impossibly fast. Before the accusation, the queen sat in a decorated chamber. After the accusation, she sat in a guarded room, surrounded by silence. She understood the shift, not through spoken words, but through absence. The absence of courtiers, of ceremony, of the king's acknowledgement. The court did not linger around a falling queen. It stepped aside and waited for the verdict. Execution functioned as both punishment and demonstration. For Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard, the scaffold was built not only to enforce the king's decision, but to reassure the public that justice had been served. The ceremony surrounding their deaths was carefully organized. The speeches, the gathering, and the controlled atmosphere created an appearance of order. Even though the decisions behind the scenes often lacked fairness, the Queen's fall became a display rather than a tragedy, and the display carried a message to anyone who might imagine questioning the king's authority. Queens understood that they lacked the right to choose the manner of their departure. Even death offered no control. A queen could not flee, resign, or step aside. She could not decide her own end. Even when despair pressed heavily, suicide, though possible in theory, was nearly impossible in practice. A queen lived under constant supervision. Her attendants reported every behavior. Her possessions were monitored. Anything that might allow her to determine her own fate was removed. The state claimed ownership not only of her life, but of her death. This absence of choice produced a quiet desperation. A queen facing downfall might not know the exact charges or timetable, but she understood the pattern. She knew how the process unfolded because she had witnessed its progression with those who came before her. She recognized the small signals, the increased presence of guards, the removal of trusted attendants, the sudden formal tone in conversations that indicated she was being prepared for a transition she could not influence. Isolation deepened this desperation. Confinement brought long hours with no responsibilities and no audience. A queen who once presided over dinners, ceremonies, and diplomatic meetings now sat alone. Listening to faint footsteps outside her chamber, she reflected on her past actions, searching for the moment where everything began to fracture. Yet the answer rarely existed within her behavior. Her fall was determined by political advantage, shifting alliances, or personal dissatisfaction, none of which she had the power to manage. The court, meanwhile, continued as if nothing unusual had happened. New arrangements were made. Conversations moved on. Preparations for the next queen began even before the current queen's fate was sealed. This efficiency reinforced the message that queenship was not a stable role, but a replaceable one. The crown did not belong to the queen. It belonged to the throne, and the throne accepted only those who remained useful. Those who survived disgrace lived with the knowledge that their honor had been taken from them. Their reputations never fully recovered. Their names entered history through brief phrases summarizing their downfall rather than their strengths. They carried the emotional weight of having been elevated publicly and destroyed publicly, without any chance to defend themselves. Their decline revealed how quickly dignity vanished once the king withdrew his favor. Beyond that decline lies a deeper question of memory, where the shadows of past queens linger in the halls long after their names fade. Along with that memory comes the quiet realization that even death did not end their influence entirely. Within the remnants of Henry VIII's world, One could sense how the silence after his death carried a weight shaped by years of fear, ceremony, and shifting loyalty. The court no longer revolved around his commands, yet the consequences of his choices remained firmly embedded in the lives of the women who had worn his crown. Their stories did not end with the king's final breath. Instead, they settled into quieter forms, extensions of lives shaped not by power, but by the memories and scars left behind. Each queen, whether she survived him or died long before, continued to cast a presence that lingered far beyond the palace walls. Catherine Parr stood apart among them. She endured Henry's decline with careful intelligence, managing both his household and the uncertainties of a king prone to suspicion. After his death, she remarried, pursuing a life not dictated by royal obligation. For a moment, she stepped into something resembling freedom. Her new marriage offered affection rather than strategy, and conversation rather than caution. Yet the hope she found lasted only briefly. Complications from childbirth ended her life soon after she believed herself finally beyond the dangers of queenship. Her death reinforced the quiet truth that escape from Henry did not eliminate the risks that followed these women through their lives. The queens who died before Henry did not acquire new futures. Their identities remained locked in the narratives crafted during their falls. Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard were defined by scandal and execution, symbols of accusation rather than individuals shaped by complexity. No retelling from the court attempted to restore their reputations. Their images remained fixed in phrases repeated without question, as though the details of their lives mattered less than the usefulness of their downfalls. They became cautionary markers rather than women whose choices and fears had once shaped the court. Catherine of Aragon, despite her dignity and unwavering presence through decades of service, was remembered through the narrow view of her inability to produce a surviving son. Her political insight, diplomatic skill, and personal resilience faded behind the narrative of her annulment. Her final years in isolation, though deeply unjust, were reduced to a simple descriptor: divorced, a word that simplified a complicated life into an ending far sharper and smaller than the woman herself. Jane Seymour occupied a different space in memory. She died soon after giving birth to Edward VI, and Henry honoured her more than any of his other wives. Yet this honour did not expand her legacy. She became the queen who succeeded by fulfilling a single requirement: producing a male heir. Her individual character, her personal thoughts, and the relationships she formed within the court remained overshadowed by the role assigned to her body. She entered history as a symbol rather than a figure with depth. Anne of Cleves, though she outlived most of the others, remained remembered primarily through Henry's disappointment. Her diplomatic value, adaptability, and intelligence were obscured by a single judgment about her appearance. She spent her later years in comfort, living independently and maintaining cordial ties to the crown. Yet, her historical image remained defined by a moment that carried neither fairness nor accuracy. The simplicity of that judgment endured longer than the truth of her life. Together, these women became compressed into a sequence repeated across generations: divorced, beheaded, died, divorced, beheaded, survived. The rhythm carried a strange lightness, masking the years of fear, maneuvering, and sorrow behind each word. Their lives were not as cleanly divided as the phrase suggested. They were layered with negotiations, illnesses, alliances, personal disappointments, and quiet endurance. Yet the world accepted the simplified version and allowed it to define them. Their shadows lingered in the spaces they once inhabited. Portraits watched over halls where new rulers passed. Their children shaped the politics of the next generation. Their influence survived in religious changes, diplomatic shifts, and the memories carried by attendants who had witnessed their joys and failures. Even the architecture of the palaces kept their presence alive. Rooms arranged to their preferences, private chambers that once held their anxieties, and courtyards where they had walked during rare moments of calm. The physical structures became quiet custodians of lives often misunderstood. Public memory treated them differently. Their names floated not through detailed accounts, but through short summaries tied to their ends. The dramatic parts of their lives overshadowed the quieter, more human aspects. People remembered their fates rather than their contributions. The stories were retold because they were easy to remember, not because they were accurate. Over time, interpretations shifted again. Writers, historians, and artists reshaped the queens into figures that fit new narratives. Some became tragic heroines, others victims, others political players. Yet in every reinterpretation, one reality stayed constant. Their identities remained anchored to Henry VIII. Even in death, they were evaluated through the lens of his power. Their presence continued, not as haunting spirits, but as structural influences, threads woven into the fabric of English history. Their experiences shaped the monarchy, the succession, and even the cultural understanding of queenship. Their stories persisted because the consequences of Henry's reign extended far beyond his life. Their lingering presence showed how the king's death did not erase the weight of the lives bound to him. Beyond that lingering memory rises the question of what dignity becomes when history chooses simplicity over truth. Against that question emerges the final realization. The crown marked them long after their names faded. Inside the Tudor court, appearances carried more authority than truth. A queen stood before the public, wrapped in layers of silk, velvet, and jewels, each piece arranged to display stability and power. Her posture, her expression, her movements, all were calculated to create the image of control. Yet beneath those polished surfaces lived a reality shaped by fear, uncertainty, and the constant pressure to maintain perfection under watchful eyes. The grandeur of the court created distance between the queen and the world around her, but it did not shield her from the tension that defined her daily life. Every public celebration required her presence. She stepped into halls lit by torches and filled with nobles who studied her carefully. Her smile became a performance, necessary not for warmth, but for reassurance. The court needed to believe the monarchy remained steady. The people needed to believe their queen embodied calm and confidence. Few understood that each smile cost her more than effort. It cost her composure. She carried grief, anxiety, and exhaustion beneath the same expression expected of her at every ceremony. This demand for emotional restraint shaped every moment of her existence. A queen could not show anger. Even when insulted, she could not display sadness. Even when suffering loss, she could not reveal fear. Even when she sensed her position weakening. To falter publicly was to invite interpretation, and interpretation often carried consequences. Her internal world remained hidden, unseen by the crowds who admired her attire and bowed to her titles. They saw the exterior, they did not see the strain behind it. The weight of the crown intensified this burden. Though physically light, it symbolized expectations that extended into every corner of her life. She had to represent virtue, fertility, diplomacy, stability, and obedience, all simultaneously and without error. The failure of any one expectation could trigger suspicion or resentment. Her identity became secondary to her role. She no longer acted as herself. She acted as the queen the kingdom demanded. Even in private rooms, she found no refuge. Attendants remained close, observing her with the same care the court displayed publicly. Conversations were overheard. Gestures were noted. Her reactions were reported. Privacy existed only in fragments, brief moments between the arrival of servants or the opening of doors. A queen learned to manage her expressions at all times, knowing that the smallest detail might reach the king or his advisors. Behind closed doors, Fear occupied the spaces left untouched by ceremony. The queen thought about the women who had stood in her position before her. She remembered the ones who had fallen. Their lives summarized into accusations that travelled faster than they could defend themselves. She understood that her beauty, intelligence, or charm did not alter her vulnerability. The court had celebrated Anne Boleyn before turning against her. It had admired Catherine Howard before condemning her. The queen knew she could be next. Her clothing, though beautiful, added to the tension. The tight bodice, heavy sleeves, and structured skirts restricted her movements, reinforcing a sense of confinement that matched the political reality surrounding her. The garments signaled power, but they also reminded her that she lived inside a role constructed for display. People saw the richness of the fabric, but not the discomfort beneath it. They noticed the glitter of jewels, but not the weight they placed on her shoulders and neck. The queen's public duties did not allow her to withdraw even when her private fears intensified. She walked through the court with grace, aware that eyes followed her every step. She addressed ambassadors with measured clarity. She oversaw household matters with composure. She greeted courtiers with controlled politeness. Each task reinforced the tension between her appearance and her inner reality. Outwardly, she embodied stability. Inwardly, she calculated risks, remembered precedents, and quietly monitored the shifting atmosphere around her. When political pressures rose, the disparity between outer elegance and inner distress grew even sharper. The queen might hear whispers suggesting dissatisfaction. She might see courtiers adjusting their behavior, aligning themselves with new factions. Such changes signaled danger long before any accusation emerged. She continued to attend feasts, wear jewels, and participate in ceremonies. Yet every gesture felt increasingly fragile. The palace, though grand, no longer seemed safe. Over time, this dual existence, one visible, one hidden, became exhausting. The queen lived between performance and survival, never certain which part of her life would determine her future. She learned to move carefully, speak cautiously, and trust sparingly. Her robes, admired by countless onlookers, concealed the tension held tightly within her frame. Her crown emphasized her rank, while reminding her of the women who had lost their lives while wearing it. The public saw only the elegance. They did not see the fear that accompanied it. They admired the splendor of the queen, without understanding the cost of maintaining such splendor in a court where misinterpretation could end a life. The contrast formed the quiet tragedy of queenship, beauty displayed outwardly, suffering contained inwardly. The deeper truth was that the more impressive the queen's appearance became, the more fragile her position often was. Silence masked a struggle. Jewelry hid distress. Ceremony disguised vulnerability. The closer she stood to power, the closer she stood to danger. Their outward brilliance revealed how deeply suffering was woven into the structure of queenship. Beyond that, brilliance rises in the final reckoning of what the crown demanded from every woman who wore it. Against that reckoning appears the closing question: what remains when the illusion falls away? Standing at the end of Henry VIII's long and troubled reign, one can look back at the lives of the women who shared his crown and see a pattern shaped not by love or partnership, but by the unyielding weight of absolute power. Becoming queen was not a dream, not a privilege, and not even an honor. It was an assignment that carried consequences far beyond ceremony. Some women were pushed toward it. Some accepted it with caution. Some feared it from the beginning. Yet none of them could truly refuse. The position consumed their freedom, redefined their identities, and determined their fate with a certainty more rigid than any law written on parchment. Their stories, 6 separate lives, formed 6 separate tragedies. Yet beneath the differences in their personalities, backgrounds, and ambitions, the same structure controlled every moment of their experience. Henry's authority, absolute and unquestioned, shaped the beginning and end of each queen's journey. No matter how intelligent, gentle, patient, devout, or politically skilled a woman was, her survival depended less on her own qualities and more on the king's satisfaction. When his admiration faded, or when political convenience demanded change, the queen became vulnerable, no matter her past loyalty or accomplishments. Catherine of Aragon represented endurance. She served as queen for decades, held the court together during wars, and maintained dignity during the years of challenge. Yet her worth narrowed to a single point: the ability to produce a male heir. When she could not, everything else disappeared. Her long service carried no protection. Her moral strength mattered less than the king's desire for a different future. She was left to die in isolation, remembered by some with sympathy, but dismissed officially with a single word: annulled. Anne Boleyn represented transformation. She ignited political and religious upheaval, changed the course of England's relationship with Rome, and brought brilliance to the court with her sharp mind and ambition. But once she failed to provide the son Henry wanted, admiration turned into suspicion. Accusations, false and violent, moved quickly. Her execution was arranged with efficiency, as though the state had been waiting for the opportunity. The woman who reshaped a kingdom died alone on a scaffold. Jane Seymour represented idealization. Henry loved her memory more than he ever loved her living presence. She gave him a son and paid for it with her life. The court honored her, but it honored her as a symbol, not as a person. Her gentleness, our intelligence, and her quiet strength received less recognition than the biological fact of an heir. Anne of Cleves represented survival by misfortune. Henry rejected her appearance, a judgment both superficial and unfair. Yet that rejection saved her. Freed from the king's expectations, she built a life of comfort, independence, and respect. She became the rare woman who escaped Henry's wrath simply because he lost interest before he found reason to punish her. Catherine Howard represented vulnerability. She entered the court too young, too unprepared, and too exposed to danger. Once Henry's affection turned into doubt, her past became a weapon used against her. The process that followed was relentless. Her execution marked not only her downfall, but the ruthlessness of a system that offered no mercy to youth, fear, or confusion. Catherine Parr represented endurance, turned into brief freedom. She managed Henry's declining years, navigated political risks, and nearly faced arrest herself. After Henry's death, she finally lived according to her own choices. Yet that freedom ended quickly, reminding anyone who looked closely that queenship left marks long after its responsibilities ended. 6 lives, 6 tragedies, 1 cause: the throne itself. Henry did not treat the crown as a partnership, but as a structure that required obedience, sacrifice, and absolute availability. The queens did not share power. They reflected it. Their lives existed not beside Henry's authority, but beneath it. They were expected to produce heirs, maintain perfect public behavior, and never challenge the king's decisions, even when those decisions threatened their safety. From the outside, queenship looked extraordinary. Beautiful clothing, lavish feasts, respect from the court, and influence over ceremony created an illusion of privilege. But beneath this illusion, the truth remained constant. The crown was a burden heavier than any jewel could disguise. The weight did not rest on the queen's head alone. It pressed into her daily routines, her relationships, her private thoughts, and her sense of self. The danger lay in how quickly the appearance of power turned into the reality of vulnerability. A queen stood in the center of attention, but remained without control. Her reputation could shift in a moment. Her alliances could dissolve without warning. Her marriage though honoured in public, could be reinterpreted by the king at any time. Even her death could become a tool for political performance. Public executions were made to look like justice. Annulments were made to look like a necessity. Exile was made to look like order. In the end, queenship under Henry VIII was not a prize. It was a confinement. Each woman entered the role with hope shaped by her own beliefs and circumstances. Each woman discovered that the limits placed around her were as rigid as the roles carved into the stone walls of the palace. Their lives showed that the crown did not elevate them. It trapped them. Their stories continue not because they were queens, but because their experiences exposed the contradiction at the heart of the Tudor monarchy. Power displayed outwardly, fear hidden inwardly. They lived in grandeur, yet lacked freedom. They lived in visibility, yet lacked safety. They lived beside the king, yet remained entirely at his mercy. And so, the final truth becomes unmistakable. The Tudor crown was never a reward. It was a cage constructed from ceremony, expectation, and the king's absolute will. Anyone who entered it walked toward a future shaped not by choice, but by danger. Thank you for listening to the journey of these 6 women whose lives were shaped by a crown that offered glory only on the surface. May your evening be calm, your thoughts be gentle, and your rest be peaceful. Good night, wherever you are.